The duke who had just adopted her was ordering her to take off her clothes? Most nobles who took in orphans treated them as nothing more than playthings. So the girl had already resigned herself to her fate. With her maid's help, she trembled as she loosened her robe, and the scars covering her back left almost no patch of skin untouched. A sight that unsettled even Julius, a man hardened by countless battles. Yet the touch the girl had braced herself for never came. Little Beau turned back in confusion, only to hear the Duke ask, his voice cold, "Who exactly did this to you?" The girl couldn't help but think of the endless beatings back at the orphanage, and the overwhelming fear left her unable to speak. Seeing how fragile she looked, Julius couldn't bring himself to press further. He told her to rest, then left the room without another word. The spacious bed felt like a soft cloud, and it was the soundest sleep Beau had had in a long time. Her maid gently washed and dressed her hair, praising her unusual hair color as being like emerald jewels, and the girl blushed at the compliment. When Bowie looked into the mirror, she was stunned by the stranger looking back at her. Carefully groomed, she looked like a princess out of a fairy tale. Every step of hers now trailed a pleasant fragrance. This kind of happiness was something little Bowie had never even dared to dream of. She was led by the attendants to a lavish dining hall, the aroma of the food tempting her senses. But when the gilded doors swung open, a painfully familiar face inside made her whole body tremble with fear. Why was the orphanage director here? Memories of the abuse she'd once suffered surged back, and Bowie froze stiffly in place, until Julius pulled her close to his side. Only then did she manage to shuffle forward in a daze. Her pale, stricken expression worried the Duke, but this wasn't the moment to comfort her. He needed to draw out proof of the director's crimes against the girl and make this scum pay. The hypocritical director had no idea of the Duke's intentions, but he'd long harbored resentment over Bowie becoming the Grand Duke's adopted daughter, worried that if she gained a noble status, she might one day seek revenge on him. With that thought, a vicious plan began to take shape in the man's mind. He would see to it that this disobedient girl was sent back to the orphanage. The girl, who had endured so much abuse, had finally found happiness, yet this despicable director was already scheming to drag her back to that place. The man fawningly told the Duke that despite Beau's frail appearance, she was actually quite a bit older than she looked, and as far as he knew, most nobles preferred younger children. Sure enough, the Duke, who had remained aloof the whole time, reacted the moment age came up. Believing his plan was working, the director grew even bolder in bad-mouthing the girl, completely oblivious to the fact that Julius's expression had grown darker and darker. Beau, meanwhile, felt her heart pounding with anxiety. She was certain that the Duke, now that he cared about her age, would send her back to that nightmarish hell. She would once again eat rotten leftovers, wear tattered, foul-smelling clothes, and perhaps even be sold off as some kind of merchandise. Gripped by fear, the girl mechanically forced food into her mouth, her trembling hands barely able to hold her knife and fork. Julius noticed something was wrong with the girl. Feeling for her, he gently told Beau to go back to her room first, saying in a soft tone that he had something to discuss with the director alone. The obedient girl had no choice but to follow the maid out. Once she was out of sight, Julius dropped his elegant facade. His voice turned icy as he asked the director where the bruises on Bowie's body had come from. Caught off guard, the director quickly fabricated a plausible-sounding excuse. He told Julius the girl had been hurt in a fight with another child, and that she was, on top of that, withdrawn and difficult. The director was eagerly waiting for the Duke to call off the adoption, but instead Julius's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Do you not recognize me?" The director shook his head hastily, trying to placate him, as one of only 5 living Grand Spirit Masters in the world. Julius's name was known to virtually everyone, but he failed to notice the murderous intent now brewing in the man's eyes. Julius demanded furiously, "Then why would you think I couldn't tell the difference when it comes to wounds like that?" The director trembled with fear and loudly protested his innocence, hoping to bluff his way through. But Julius simply raised a hand to signal his attendant, who presented a tray. On it lay a pair of blood-stained glasses. Seeing this, the director completely panicked. The next moment, the man snapped his fingers elegantly, and a swarm of guards flooded in, surrounding the grimy, overweight man. Julius coldly ordered his arrest, but his mind was already filled with the image of the girl trembling in fear. He needed to go comfort his little princess. With that thought, his expression gradually softened. No one could have guessed that in the days ahead, this brother with no blood relation to her would slowly unlock a full-blown sister complex, becoming an utterly devoted, doting brother. After dealing with the greedy director, Julius grew worried about little Boe's health. The sight of that trembling child tugged at his heart, and to put her at ease, the man decided to finalize her adoption papers as soon as possible. Meanwhile, back alone in her room, Bohe was crying helplessly. She knew full well the director's words had all been lies, but paralyzed by fear, she hadn't even had the courage to argue back. Just then, an urgent knock interrupted her thoughts, and just as she'd expected, it was a summons from the Duke. Though little Bo had already prepared herself to be sent back to the orphanage, thinking back on the brief happiness of the past 2 days still left a bittersweet ache in her chest. She still remembered that warm cup of cocoa, only now she'd never get to taste it again. Before she knew it, the girl had been brought before Julius. Worried that little Boe hadn't eaten enough, the Duke had specially prepared a lavish spread of food for her, but the girl's attention was entirely fixed on the document in the man's hand. Bo mistakenly assumed it was a contract to dissolve their adoption. A wave of hurt filled her chest. She didn't want to let go of this happiness that had felt so close within reach. At that moment, little Bo summoned every ounce of courage she had. She told the Duke that she wasn't the bad child the director had described. She'd never been in a fight, and she'd had friends too, only they'd all been adopted already. Her voice grew smaller and smaller as she spoke, and with her head bowed, she looked as though she were awaiting a final verdict. Julius knew his little princess had misunderstood. In a gentle voice, he told Bohe that the document was actually the adoption terms, and it still needed her own signature to take effect. The sudden reversal was almost too much to take in, and the girl stood frozen, in disbelief as the Duke gently knelt on one knee, his broad palm resting softly on the crown of her head. "Say whatever you want to say. From now on, we'll be family to each other." The adoption process had just one final step left. The butler held out an ink pad, gesturing for little Bohe to press her handprint onto it. Her heart brimmed with anticipation, as she used nearly all her strength to press her small hand at the bottom of the document. For a long while afterward, Bo's heart wouldn't stop pounding uncontrollably. It felt just like a dream. She was no longer that orphan anyone could bully. So this was what it felt like, having a family who cherished her. The girl who had endured so much abuse had, through her own effort, become the center of everyone's affection. It had been over 2 months since little Bo was adopted, and during that time she'd shown a remarkable gift for learning. Even the ever-serious teacher Trana couldn't stop praising the girl's outstanding performance. Still, worried that studying alone might leave little Bohe feeling lonely, the teacher suggested, out of genuine care, that the girl might want to study alongside noble young ladies her own age. This left little Bo filled with anticipation. Perhaps she could make a few new friends through her studies. Still, ever the well-behaved girl, she told her teacher she'd need to discuss it with the Duke before making a decision. No sooner had she finished speaking than the study door swung open, and the one who walked in was the very brother she thought of day and night. She rushed excitedly to Julius's side and repeated teacher Trana's suggestion to him. Looking at his little sister's hopeful eyes, the man's own eyes were full of indulgent affection. In just a few days apart, his little princess had grown taller again. He told Bohe that a small matter like this was hers to decide, and with that he turned to leave. But just then, the girl behind him pitifully tugged at the hem of his coat. Her small face turned up with anticipation as she asked her brother if he could stay and have dinner with her. Little Bo knew it was already a lot that her brother, buried in official duties, had come to visit her at all, but she still couldn't help wanting the Duke to spend just a little more time with her. Unsurprisingly, she was met with her brother's refusal, and she lowered her head, feeling wronged. Julius, too, sensed his sister's disappointment. But with the war situation tense right now, all he could do was keep her request in mind. Unable to invite her brother, Boe spent the whole day in low spirits, and it was only thanks to her maid's comfort and a delicious dinner that she finally managed to cheer up a little. All she could do now was study hard and try not to be a burden to her brother. Just then, the butler walked in carrying a bottle of strange-colored medicine. The girl's small, palm-sized face scrunched up instantly. She knew this was her brother's way of showing he cared. So even though the medicine was unusually bitter, she obediently forced herself to drink it down. Little Bo's polite, sensible manner had, without anyone quite noticing, won over everyone's affection. After finishing the medicine, the girl returned to her desk to keep studying. Then the butler announced that a visitor had arrived, specifically for her. The girl had already begun imagining her first meeting with a new friend. Completely unaware that she was about to be given a hard time, the arrogant young noblewoman had actually come to watch her make a fool of herself. Little Bo gracefully lifted the hem of her skirt and performed a greeting so textbook perfect it put the etiquette manuals to shame, which made Azella narrow her eyes in displeasure. She had come intending to watch this lowly adopted girl embarrass herself, but instead found that the girl's poised bearing was every bit a match for young ladies of the most distinguished pedigree. A wicked idea began to form in Azella's mind. She flashed the girl a friendly-looking smile, then steered the conversation toward Little Bo's humble origins. Watching the girl's uncomfortable expression gave her an enormous sense of satisfaction. The sensitive Little Bo could faintly sense the hostility in the girl, but not wanting to make things awkward for either of them, she deliberately changed the subject, asking who exactly the young man standing beside Azella was. This quiet, wooden-faced young man hadn't said a single word since walking in, always trailing behind the girl, which naturally made Little Bo curious. Having finally found an opportunity to humiliate Bohei, Azella had no intention of letting it slip by. She glanced back at her attendant and remarked, almost carelessly, that she'd picked the boy up from the market, where he'd been fought over by many, all because of his unusual red eyes. Bo was unsettled by her attitude of treating a person like an object, but before she knew it, the girl's gaze had turned to her instead. Your eyes are quite unusual in color, too. If you were put up for sale, you'd probably fetch a good price as well, wouldn't you? Azella's shameless mockery finally set off Bo's temper. The girl felt the blood rushing through her veins. Perhaps now was the time to get angry. Because Azella hadn't just insulted her, she'd insulted her family, her brother, too. At that moment, Bohei wanted nothing more than to throw the tea in her hand straight at Azella's smug face, but in the end, she held herself back. Anger wasn't the best way to solve this. That she came from an orphanage was already no secret, and all the girl could do was try to become a capable, outstanding young lady, one who wouldn't bring trouble to her brother. With that thought, little Bohei maintained her graceful composure, saying with a smile that they could discuss such topics once they knew each other a little better. But little Bo never expected that her own magnanimity would only make Azella push even further. The girl hadn't imagined that the first gift she'd receive after being adopted would be a clean, well-groomed young man. Little Bo's polite, dignified restraint only emboldened Azella further. Putting on a show of warmth, she had her attendant stand beside the girl, generously offering to lend the boy to Bohei for a week. After all, she said, their humble airs made them a perfect match. Little Bo, thoroughly provoked by this rude mockery, darkened her face and rose to give the girl a piece of her mind, unaware that the vicious Azella had been waiting precisely for the girl to lose her composure. But just then, the loud bang of a door being pushed open broke the awkward tension in the room. Little Bo hadn't expected her rescuer to be the usually stern-faced butler. The man politely showed the red-haired girl out, and the perceptive Azella had no choice but to follow him out. As the sound of footsteps faded away, the girl looked down at her clenched hands, her delicate palms marked with the imprints of her own nails. She sighed, blaming herself. If it hadn't been for Mr. Roll's timely arrival, and she might have brought shame on her brother and their family. The obedient girl reflected quietly on herself, then suddenly remembered the red-eyed boy she'd left standing there this whole time. Little Bo asked him if he'd like to sit and have something to eat, but to her surprise, the expressionless boy flatly refused. With a solemn face, he declared that eating cake was something only children did, though his height, nearly the same as Bowie's, did little to back up the claim. The girl couldn't help but let out a small laugh. The joy of chatting with someone her own age made her eager to become friends with the boy. Little Bo gently asked for his name, but when he took a while to answer, she went ahead and said, "My eyes are the color of mint, so that's my name too, Bohei. Yours are red, so how about I call you?" Before she could finish, the boy cut in, saying his name was Julian, and that as a lowly servant, he wasn't fit to have his master know his name. But the girl's innocent manner made it hard for him to refuse. He could tell that little Bohei had a kind heart, though the boy didn't yet realize that this small, adorable figure was quietly slipping into his heart. A childhood friendship, it seemed, could be just as sweet as any romance. Little Bo was in the courtyard enjoying the flowers with her new friend, soft sunlight scattering over the girl as she gently unwrapped her lunchbox, warmly asking the boy beside her if he'd like to try some. But Julian declined with a blank expression. This left little Bohei feeling a pang of disappointment, though with her sensitive nature, she also understood the boy was keeping his distance because of his status. The girl put on a show of difficulty, saying this portion had been specially prepared just for him, and this time, The cold on the outside, warm on the inside boy finally couldn't bring himself to refuse. Little Bo happily shared the sweets with Julian, and just then a breeze swept by, carrying a lovely petal that landed perfectly in front of the girl. Its smooth curve looking as if it had been painted straight out of a picture. Little Bo's eyes lit up with delight. She carefully cupped the petal in her hands and held it out to Julian. But the boy, oblivious to the sentiment, tossed the one-of-a-kind gift straight into the trash. Watching her gift get discarded left the girl feeling a little embarrassed, and she said quietly that it had been meant as a gift for him. Bo's words touched something soft in the boy's heart. He hurried back to the trash bin and began digging through it earnestly, sweat trickling down his cheeks, yet he refused to give up. At last, Julian found the petal with its special meaning, carefully wrapped it in a handkerchief, and told Bo with utter sincerity that he would treasure this gift. Looking at the boy in front of her covered in dirt, the girl felt both moved and a pang of sympathy. If it weren't for the constraints of their positions, they surely would have become close friends. But the master-servant relationship kept the boy from ever fully opening his heart, and so, not wanting to burden Julian too heavily, little Bo decided to find some common ground with him first. Curious, she asked him what his life had been like before, but the moment the words left her mouth, little Bo already regretted it. Given how sharp-tongued Azella was, there was no way things had been easy for Julian. The boy sighed helplessly and said that sooner or later he'd be taken away in the night. The naive girl assumed this meant the boy would be captured and abused, and she reached out with sympathy to hold his arm. But this intimate scene happened to be witnessed by the Duke who had come to visit little Bohei. The doting brother, who adored his little sister endlessly, actually felt a flash of jealousy. The moment Julius arrived in the courtyard, he saw little Bohei affectionately holding on to another young man's arm, and the sight of his precious little princess showing warmth toward another male made the man's eyes narrow in displeasure. He strode quickly over to the two of them. The moment little Bo saw it was her brother, she broke into a sweet smile and eagerly introduced her new friend, but the Duke cut her off at an inopportune moment. The girl immediately realized she shouldn't be bothering her busy brother with such trivial matters. And just as she was about to change the subject, Julius spoke first, asking whether she'd eaten yet. Caught off guard by the question, little Bo suddenly remembered the last time she'd invited her brother and been turned down, and not wanting to put him in an awkward spot. She deliberately looped her arm through Julian's and said in a docile tone that she was actually just about to have lunch with the boy. She hadn't expected her brother's expression to darken even further instead of softening. Unsure what she'd said wrong, she added quietly that she could take care of herself and that he shouldn't worry about her. Watching his sister act polite yet distant, Julius couldn't help feeling a pang of loss. He'd carved time out of his packed schedule just to grant his sister's wish, yet now it seemed someone else was already willing to stay by her side. With that thought, the Duke's gaze deepened as he studied the black-haired, red-eyed boy. Julian noticed the Duke's scrutiny as well and stepped forward solemnly to bow, humbly declaring that he would serve his master with everything he had. The boy's composed manner earned the Duke's approval, and although Julius's jealousy hadn't quite faded, what mattered more to him was his little princess's happiness. With that thought, the man turned and walked away with a wistful air, telling Bohei before he left that they'd have a meal together next time. It was only then that the slow-witted girl realized her brother had come specifically to invite her to lunch, and little Bohei couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Still, thinking of her brother's unspoken tenderness, a bit of sweetness stirred in her heart. She still didn't know that her happy days were about to come to an end, and before long she would find herself facing execution. The girl who had endured so much suffering at the orphanage had only just found happiness, yet her newly made friend would end up pushing her straight into a terrifying abyss. A week passed in the blink of an eye, and the day finally came to return Julian. The girl accepted an invitation and rode in a carriage to Azella's estate, where Azella, true to form, kept mocking and needling little Bohei. Yet the unshaken girl maintained her composure throughout. Before she left, the butler had reminded her that if she didn't want to associate with such overbearing noble young ladies, she could simply refuse. The ducal household would always have her back. But the sensible little Bo calmly said it was fine. She didn't want to become the withdrawn child the director had once described. Silently, the girl cheered herself on. This was simply one of the trials she had to pass on her way to becoming a proper young lady, and she believed that one day she would make her brother proud. Azella hadn't expected that all the humiliation she'd so carefully planned would have no effect whatsoever. Instead, the girl's composed demeanor made her look like an ignorant clown, especially when she saw little Bohei laughing and chatting happily with Julian. The warm scene struck a deep blow to her arrogant pride. To save face, Azella suggested they all head to the Empire's most rundown slum district, a place teeming with beggars. Once there, she'd have another chance to thoroughly humiliate little Bohei. The girl couldn't wait to order the coachman to turn the carriage around, completely unaware of just how dangerous a move this was. Seeing this, little Bo could only sigh helplessly. She could already picture Azella's smug tone as she mocked her later. In truth, verbal attacks like these no longer upset her much, but this kind of exhausting social sparring still wore her out. If every noble young lady turned out to be like Azella, she was sure she'd break down eventually. With that thought, the girl's gaze drifted to Julian beside her, and the boy was gazing back at her just as intently. She really did prefer being friends with Julian after all. The clatter of hooves gradually slowed without her noticing, and little Bohei curiously peered out the window. But the moment she looked, she flinched back in fear. A group of armed thugs had surrounded their carriage, their eyes brimming with hunger, as if they meant to devour the girl's whole. The lovely girl was now surrounded by a crowd of leering beggars. Little Bo had never imagined she'd end up somewhere so hostile. Even through the glass, she could feel the danger closing in. But Azella beside her calmly said not to worry, since they had night escorts. And just as she'd said, the thugs were beaten down and begged for mercy. And just as Bohei let out a sigh of relief, the carriage suddenly lurched violently. It turned out a thug hiding in the shadows had seized the moment to cut the horses' reins. The startled horses let out a shrill neigh and bolted straight toward the cliff, and in that split second, Julian threw caution to the wind, wrapping the fragile girl carefully in his arms, using his own body as a shield to protect her. The boy's embrace was warm and steady, instantly driving away all of the girl's fear. But an even greater crisis awaited them. The moment the Duke learned his sister was in danger, he rushed to the scene as fast as he could, but he still arrived a step too late. The wreckage of the carriage told of just how violent the crash had been. Fortunately, there was no blood found inside, which meant Bohei might have been taken by the thugs partway through. An uncontrollable surge of murderous intent welled up in Julius's eyes. He swore he would make whoever had hurt his sister pay dearly. Meanwhile, the kidnapped little Bohei had already been taken to a rundown warehouse, where several other noble children were also being held captive. Fortunately, Julian had stayed by her side the whole time, which gave the girl a small measure of comfort. Little Bo forced herself to sit up, and calmly looked around, but she couldn't find Azella anywhere. Even though that spoiled noble girl was thoroughly unpleasant, the kind-hearted Bohei still couldn't help asking about her whereabouts. But just then, a leering man kicked open the tightly shut door. Julian quickly moved to shield the girl, but with a single kick, the man sent the frail boy sprawling to the ground. He laughed uncontrollably, then grabbed little Bo's wrist. "I heard you're the adopted daughter of the Ectonia family?" A wave of unease surged through the girl's heart, and glancing at the banner with its strange emblem on the wall, she realized that this man before her was her brother's mortal enemy, and that she might very well die here. She had finally found a brother who cherished her, only for the girl to now be sent to the executioner's block. The kidnapped little Bohei had accidentally let slip her identity as the Duke's adopted daughter, her brother's sworn enemy, and because of that, she was forcibly dragged to the execution grounds. The thick smell of blood made the girl on the platform tremble, while below the mob roared in a frenzy, waves of hatred nearly drowning the girl entirely. Everyone wanted to seize her, to torture her to death in the most horrifying way possible, their jeers growing louder and louder. Yet facing death head-on, little Bo remained unexpectedly calm. She remembered what her brother had once told her. "You are a noble young lady. You must never kneel and beg like someone lowly." The girl's composure only enraged the frenzied mob further. They roared that she should be sacrificed to the gods right then and there. Poor little Bo was roughly dragged onto the scaffold, the sharp blade hanging overhead. The girl trembled uncontrollably, but she didn't cry or scream out of fear. Instead, she quietly asked the executioner if she could speak her final words. The crowd below erupted in a wave of mocking laughter. They were all waiting for the girl to break down in tears and beg for mercy. But to everyone's shock, this small, frail child suddenly summoned astonishing courage. She glared defiantly at the crowd below and, with all her strength, cursed them as fools who could only vent their frustrations on children. Having said her piece, the girl calmly lowered her head, and in a daze, she thought she could hear her brother praising her for a job well done. She had done it. She hadn't disgraced her brother's name. But the pain she expected never came. A tall figure appeared like a beam of light, blocking out all the darkness for her. Julius struck with his sword, and the thug who had just been screaming turned into a cold corpse in an instant. Seeing that it was the brother she'd longed for, the girl's heart, which had been hanging by a thread, finally settled. She stared stunned at the Duke's back. This man, so full of killing intent toward everyone else, only ever softened his gaze when he looked at her. Julius spoke gently, telling little Bowie to close her eyes. He didn't want his little princess to witness such a bloody scene. With that, his gaze turned sharp again. These people who dared to bully my sister all deserve to die. When a sister-obsessed brother discovers his little princess has been bullied, just how severe are the consequences? Murderous intent filled Julius's eyes. It was this mob who had dared to try to hurt his precious little sister, and in fury, the man cut down the scattering thugs one by one. In an instant, the small execution grounds turned into an earthly hell. Yet faced with such a brutal scene, little Bo couldn't bring herself to close her eyes. Her brother's tall, valiant figure looked just like a knight guarding his princess, and his handsome form kept her from looking away. But at some point, unnoticed, one surviving thug had crept up beside the girl, and before little Bowie could react, he yanked her in front of him, pressing a sharp dagger against her neck. "If you want to live, tell the Duke, drenched in blood, to stop right now." Julius turned around instantly, his cold eyes filled with murderous intent, but instead of stopping, he walked straight toward his sister. The thug had already lost his earlier bravado, but the man had no intention of letting him go. Gently, he reminded his sister that this time, she really needed to close her eyes. Little Bo nodded obediently, and the next moment she heard the whistle of a blade slicing through the air. The man's screams rang out one after another, and the girl covered her ears in fear. But just then, a pair of strong arms gently lifted her up. And when she opened her eyes again, little Bo found herself steadily cradled in her brother's arms. Experiencing a gentle princess carry for the first time, the girl flailed in panic, and the man immediately told her to wrap her arms around his shoulders. His heartbeat was warm and strong, and even though his whole body still carried the air of battle, it couldn't hide the doting look in his eyes. Julius chuckled softly, teasing the girl in his arms, so it turned out his sister called people idiots when she got angry too. Little Bo lowered her head in embarrassment, but her gaze was drawn to the tangled bodies scattered across the ground. The horrifying scene felt hauntingly familiar, and she felt her stomach churn as her consciousness began to fade. Her brother's soft, soothing voice was like a lullaby in the night, and cradled in the Duke's warm arms, little Bowie drifted off to sleep. But once back at the ducal estate, the girl came down with a high fever that very night. The illness dragged on so persistently that she couldn't tell dream from reality, and many people grew worried about her. She wanted to respond, but her body felt as heavy as lead, refusing to move, so all she could do was struggle within her dreams. Yet when little Bo opened her eyes again, she found herself back in that hellish orphanage. The injured girl's fever wouldn't break, and her devoted brother had no choice but to keep watch over her through the night. Trapped in a terrifying nightmare, little Bohe found the demons within her mind endlessly amplifying her own sense of inferiority. A child with a face identical to hers wore a sweet smile, while speaking the cruelest words. Every sentence seemed aimed straight at little Bo. "Someone with your background doesn't deserve happiness." The girl jolted awake from her dream, the vivid images leaving her breathless with panic, her frail body trembling slightly. Just then, a warm, large hand came to rest on the back of hers, and the warmth from that palm effectively soothed her sensitive heart. Little Bo slowly lifted her head and met her brother's worried gaze. The man reached up gently to check her temperature. Hearing her brother tell her to sleep a little longer, the girl obediently curled back into bed. But as she lay down, she accidentally jostled her wound, and the sudden sharp pain brought tears welling up in Bo's eyes. That her bones hadn't been broken was already a blessing, and seeing his sister's pitiful state, Julius felt a pang of sympathy in his chest. But at that moment, he found himself recalling the image of the girl walking toward death in despair. If he had arrived even a few seconds later, he might have lost his little princess forever. With that thought, the man's tone grew grave. He asked his sister earnestly why she hadn't believed he would come to save her. Little Bo froze at the question, and the terrifying inner demon from her dream surfaced once again. whispering to her that a young lady wasn't worthy of such noble happiness, that she wasn't fit to be a proper young lady at all. The girl painfully rejected the demon's temptation. Yet whenever she thought of her lowly origins, she couldn't help feeling she didn't deserve her brother's affection. Faced with his sister's silence, the considerate Julius chose not to press further. Instead, he told her gently that "I haven't earned your trust is my failing." With that, he gently changed the damp cloth on her forehead. Little Bo thought she had upset her brother again and lowered her head in dismay. But then she heard him solemnly promise that no matter where she was when danger struck, he would rush to save her the moment he could. After saying this, Julius was about to stand and let his sister sleep a little longer, but he felt a small, pale hand tug pitifully at the hem of his coat. Who would have guessed that the Empire's most powerful warrior was, in fact, a gentle, doting, sister-obsessed brother? Julius only ever revealed his tender side in front of Little Bo. Just like now, with his sister pitifully tugging at his coat, asking in a soft, sweet voice for him to stay and lull her to sleep. The girl's adorable manner was impossible to refuse, and after just a second's hesitation, the Duke gracefully sat back down. Still, he said gently that he had a terrible singing voice and couldn't offer her a sweet lullaby. Little Bo had been fretting over her unreasonable request, but her brother had agreed so readily. The girl quickly curled back under the covers, her big bright eyes wide open, and seeing this, Julius couldn't help but tease her. "You don't look like you have any intention of sleeping at all." It was only then that Little Bo noticed her brother watching her with a smile, and she had no choice but to obediently close her eyes. The man's voice was like a gentle cello, his caring words carrying a soothing, almost hypnotic magic, gradually healing the girl's sensitive heart. At first, Little Bo could still answer his questions in a hazy sort of way, but slowly she felt her body growing lighter and lighter, as if floating on a soft cloud. A broad palm gently stroked the crown of her head, and that deep, comforting affection left the girl feeling strangely at peace. Outside the window, an owl let out a terrifying hoot in the darkness, but Little Bo felt no fear at all, because she knew her brother would always stay by her side, watching over her. When she woke up, most of her illness had already faded, and she decided to go visit Julian, who had risked his life to protect her. She'd already heard that the boy had been seriously injured, but seeing him with his whole body wrapped in bandages still left her feeling even worse. Tears welling in her eyes, the girl apologized to Julian over and over, but the badly wounded boy brushed it off, saying he was fine, wishing only that he could grow up faster so he could better protect little Bowie. The girl was moved to the verge of tears, but the moment she thought about her good friend having to go back and serve as Azala's servant once he recovered, Little Bo decided to ask her brother if Julian could stay by her side instead. His cherished sister wanting to live alongside another man, Julius couldn't help but feel a surge of jealousy well up. Seeing her brother's expression darken, little Bowie realized her words might have given him the wrong idea. She hastily explained in a panic that she only hoped Julian could stay and continue living at the ducal estate. But to the girl's surprise, her brother simply replied with a flat, "I see," then handed her a plate of sweet-smelling chocolate. Little Bo obediently took small bites, only to hear her brother ask, seemingly offhand, what exactly that black-haired, red-eyed slave boy meant to her. The blunt question nearly made the girl choke. She couldn't understand why the Duke would ask her such a thing, when the person she liked was clearly her brother. At that thought, Bowie's small palm-sized face flushed bright red, and she rushed to clarify to the Duke that her relationship with Julian was entirely innocent. That gentle black-haired boy was to her a dear friend and a benefactor. She couldn't bear the thought of him suffering back at Azala's household, but it was purely out of the precious bond of friendship between them. Hearing this, the Duke's gaze gradually softened. In truth, even if little Bo's heart had belonged to someone else, he could never bring himself to refuse any request from his sister. Still, Julius hoped his sister would learn to voice her wants with confidence. Patiently, he guided the timid girl, trying to help her rediscover the boldness she'd had when she first arrived at the estate. "Just say whatever you want to say boldly." Little Bo lowered her head, torn. But the thought of her friend suffering misfortune because of her cowardice hardened her resolve. Trembling, she clenched her hands and, in a voice filled with unshakable determination, said she hoped Julian wouldn't be sent away, that she wanted to stay friends with him. Her eyes were full of hope, and the Duke, amused by his sister's earnest reaction, teased her gently. "If anyone saw you looking like that, they'd think I was bullying you." The bashful little Bohe wished she could disappear into the floor, while beside her, Julius's gaze deepened. It seemed his sister still couldn't fully trust him, but there were still plenty of days ahead for them together. Perhaps it wouldn't be long before he received an invitation to dinner from his own little princess. With that thought, a faint trace of doting affection flickered in the man's eyes, but just then, the butler appeared in the front hall with a badly wounded Julian in tow. Just how far would a brother go to spoil his sister? Little Bo hadn't expected the Duke not only to take Julian in, but to even allow the boy to join the Empire's elite order of immortal knights, a feat that should have been utterly impossible for someone of his status as a slave. The girl joyfully shared this hard-won piece of good news with her friend, then looked gratefully at her brother, and Julius returned her gaze with the same doting affection. As long as his little princess was happy, that was all that mattered. The man then turned his gaze to the black-haired boy beside her. He had no objection to little Bohe having one more close friend, but if the boy's approach to his sister had any ulterior motive, he wouldn't hold back. In the days that followed, little Bohe stayed at the estate to recover peacefully, while the Duke went to handle the remaining aftermath. Julius had almost all the masterminds behind the kidnapping executed, and the remaining scattered stragglers were rounded up by members of the Knight Order. The man vented all the fury he felt over his sister's injury onto the captured prisoners, and his brutal interrogations spared no one. It was from the mouths of these thugs that he learned this seemingly random kidnapping had, in fact, been specifically targeted at little Bohe, and that Lady Azella, who had led his sister to that slum district, had played no small part in making it happen. So the next day, the Duke invited Azella's father to pay a visit to the estate. The moment the Marquis arrived, Julius had him brought straight to the study, and with a grave expression, the man demanded that he replace every single servant in his household, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. The Duke had two reasons for doing this. One was to grant his sister's wish to keep Julian by her side. The other was to punish the Marquis, in a roundabout way, for having failed to properly raise his goddaughter. Accompanying the Marquis was his spoiled daughter, Azella. The kidnapping incident hadn't taught the girl a single lesson. She arrogantly held out a bouquet of flowers, her apology utterly insincere, her eyes still brimming with an air of untouchable arrogance. The butler beside her couldn't help but worry about little Bohe's situation. In all their previous run-ins, it was always his young mistress who ended up wronged, and he assumed this gentle-natured girl would be caught off guard by Azella's arrogance once again. But to his surprise, this time little Bohe displayed remarkable composure, her poised bearing calm and elegant. In sheer presence alone, she was already a match for anyone, and the butler couldn't help but smile with relief. This at last was how a proper young lady ought to carry herself. The girl who had endured so much abuse had only just found happiness, yet the jealousy of her so-called friend nearly cost her her life. Up until now, little Bo had endured Azella's provocations as much as she could, but her unconditional restraint had only invited even more shameless overreach. From the moment she walked in, Azella struck a haughty pose, saying arrogantly that it was a mole within the Marquise's own household who had caused the kidnapping, that she'd had no idea whatsoever about the danger of the slum district. So why should she be the one apologizing? She then displayed, with a wounded expression, a small scrape on her arm, her dismissive attitude thoroughly repulsive. Little Bo's expression darkened instantly. If it hadn't been for her brother's timely arrival, she might well have been tortured to death by those brutal thugs. The girl refused to accept this attempt to shift blame. But the willful, unreasonable Azella suddenly flew into a rage at that moment. She slammed the table and stood up without a shred of composure, loudly demanding to know if little Bo was trying to steal her attendant, blaming her for the kidnapping just to cover it up. She followed this with an angry declaration, "Julian is mine, and I won't let this go." Hearing this, little Bo felt her blood boil. That gentle black-haired boy was her best friend, yet in Azella's mouth he'd been reduced to a worthless piece of property. The thought that the boy might face such unfair treatment again back at the Marquise's estate made little Boe decide she wouldn't hold back any longer. Calmly, she stated that since the thugs had already seen Julian's face, only by staying at the ducal estate could his safety be guaranteed. The girl's gaze was gentle yet resolute, a completely different person from the timid child she'd once been, and Azella, taken aback by little Bo's newfound presence for the first time, grew even more furious once she recovered, hurling insults about the girl being calculating and scheming. But the elegant little lady no longer wished to entangle herself further with the disgraceful Azella. She offered a distant smile and said calmly that if this was what it would take to satisfy her, then she was welcome to go and lodge her complaint. Watching Azela grit her teeth in fury, little Bo felt an especially satisfying sense of relief, though she had no idea that even greater danger awaited her. The Marquise's daughter, who had bullied the girl for so long, finally received the punishment she deserved. Little Bo never expected that the proud, haughty Azela would eventually have her own day of groveling. These days, she wrote several love letters to Julian every single day, yet the young man remained utterly cold toward his former mistress's advances. Even so, the Marquise's daughter kept sending letters without fail, rain or shine, and her love letters had become the laughingstock of the entire ducal estate. Still, little Bo could roughly understand Azela's feelings. The boy's striking looks and gentle nature made him seem like a knight straight out of a fairy tale. And if anyone was to blame, it was Azela's past self for not knowing how to cherish what she'd had. At that very moment, Julian was thoughtfully helping little Bo check her letters for mistakes. Over this stretch of time, they'd kept up a steady exchange of correspondence, and the gentle boy always replied to the girl earnestly. It was thanks to Julian's help that little Bo's reading and writing had improved so rapidly in such a short time. Having finished checking her letter, the boy warmly praised the girl's remarkable progress. But just then the butler suddenly arrived, telling the girl that the Duke wished to see her. Little Boy immediately agreed to her brother's invitation with delight. And watching the girl's retreating figure, Julian felt a slight pang of loss in his heart. Still, considering the vast difference in their statuses, the boy chose to bury this humble affection deep within. Meanwhile, little Bo had already arrived at the door of her brother's office, and the moment she stepped inside, she saw a mountain of letters piled up on his desk. When Julius saw it was his sister, he immediately set aside his work and warmly invited her to have lunch with him. Little Bo caught the note of exhaustion in her brother's voice, and she asked obediently whether, now that she'd learned to read and write, she could help him with some of his workload. Surprised by his sister's thoughtfulness and not wanting to disappoint the girl, Julius handed over the task of sorting through his correspondence to little Boy. Gently, the man lifted his sister up onto the chair, and the girl immediately became full of energy, diligently reading through each letter, but the more she read, the more she realized that most of them were tediously written love letters. So it turned out her brother was quite popular with the ladies. Little Bo felt both proud and a little dejected, unsure when, if ever, she'd become as impressive as her brother. But reading through the love letters proved terribly boring, and the drowsy girl felt her eyelids growing heavier and heavier. Before long, she drifted off to sleep. She had no idea that the man beside her was watching her with eyes full of doting affection. What would she do if she accidentally fell asleep in her brother's arms? Little Bo blinked her drowsy eyes open, the man beside her still absorbed in reviewing the documents in his hands, and she quickly sat up straight in a panic, forcing a serious expression as if nothing had happened. But little Bohei had no idea that her brother had seen the whole thing. Julius's eyes were full of gentle affection as he teased his little princess with a smile. "You were sleeping so soundly just now, you'd even started snoring." Embarrassed by her brother's remark, the girl hurriedly stammered out excuses, and her adorable reaction made Julius chuckle. He told her, smiling, that he'd only been joking, but that she really had been sleeping quite deeply. As he spoke, a look of worry crossed the man's face. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed his sister staying up late at night to read and study. While Julius looked forward to his little princess's growth, he wished even more for his sister to have a healthy body. Not wanting to worry her brother, little Bo obediently promised she would only study during the daytime from now on, and ever the diligent one, she went back to sorting through the remaining letters. Most of the love letters she could now read through quickly, thanks in part to the wonderful romance novel she'd read the night before. Not yet understanding the complicated feelings between men and women, the girl could only simplify these matters into a kind of longing for family. Just like how she loved her brother now, little Bo couldn't help but wonder, would someone as remarkable as her brother eventually consider having a few children of his own? Julius was caught off guard by the question, but the butler's ill-timed cough interrupted this thought-provoking exchange. He teased Julius playfully, saying he hadn't expected the lord to actually be considering having children, and the Duke, mocked by his close friend, hastily denied it, though the butler simply ignored his response entirely. The man elegantly handed little Bo a carefully prepared dessert, and the girl's face immediately lit up with delight. She patted the thick stack of letters in front of her and told the butler earnestly that seeing all these love letters written to her brother was exactly what had made her think of having children. At that moment, little Bo failed to notice that Roel's expression had turned distinctly unamused. A girl who only loved her brother was about to be taken into the Emperor's harem. As she listened to her maid's report, Julius's expression instantly turned grim. Without pausing to explain to his sister, the man gently lifted his little princess from her chair, his face grave as he instructed the butler to bring the young lady back to her room as quickly as possible. Seeing her brother's serious expression, the obedient girl immediately followed the butler. But inside, little Bo couldn't shake her growing worry. Even when her brother killed people, he never showed this much emotion. What kind of guest could possibly make the Empire's most distinguished duke this wary? Just as the girl was lost in thought, the butler in front of her suddenly stopped in his tracks, and with a loud thud, little Bo rubbed her aching forehead. As she looked up to find a man with a leering face, freezing in place, unsure what to do. Fortunately, the butler reacted quickly, shielding the girl behind him, as he loudly scolded the herald for barging into the private residence without the duke's permission, then turned furiously on the knights nearby, demanding to know why they hadn't stopped the man. The knights had no answer. The leering count, however, put on a slick, obsequious smile, arrogantly declaring that he was His Majesty's herald and that no one in this land could refuse the Emperor's command. He then put on an even more disgusting display, telling the butler to be smart and kneel down to beg for mercy right then and there. Little Bo cowered behind the butler in fear. This strange man made her feel deeply uneasy, and she curled up as small as she could. But her mint-colored hair still caught the Count's attention. The man's expression turned into something lecherous and vile, and he announced with delight that he'd finally laid eyes on the Duke's noble adopted daughter. The Empress had ordered that Lady Bo be invited to the palace for a rendezvous. Little Bo was terrified. She had no idea how to refuse such an outrageous request. Just then, a chilling voice rang out from behind the herald. "Who gave you permission to see her?" The Count, who moments ago had been so brazenly arrogant, instantly lost all his swagger the way he'd shown toward the butler, and instead tried to curry favor with the Duke. But Julius's dark expression showed not the slightest sign of easing, daring to set his sights on his precious little princess. He wouldn't be showing any mercy this time. Her brother's timely rescue calmed all of the girl's unease, and curiously peeking out, she saw that her brother had already drawn the sword at his side. Just how possessive can a sister-obsessed brother be? Without a word, Julius drew his blade. So it's this man, daring to covet his precious little sister. The Duke pressed the sword to the herald's throat with a cold smile, and the once arrogant Count was instantly reduced to a quivering, terrified mess. Watching the man's pathetic state, little Bo felt an immense sense of satisfaction, but not wanting to worry her brother, she quickly followed the butler back to her room. It wasn't until the door closed behind her that the girl's tense nerves finally relaxed. But thinking back on what had just happened, Bo couldn't help but look worried again. She asked Roel beside her whether her brother might act rashly and kill the Empress's herald. Even from that distance, she'd been able to feel the sheer weight of the Duke's fury, and she didn't want her brother to suffer any consequences because of her. The butler's expression, however, remained remarkably calm. He gently reassured his young mistress that the Duke had only meant to threaten the man, though the young lady's current situation, he added, was rather more dangerous. Roel explained the current state of affairs to little Bo in careful detail, telling her that the reigning emperor was a ruthless madwoman who had swept across the entire continent single-handedly. Not only was she formidable in combat, her mastery of magic was equally terrifying, and her daughter had once been briefly engaged to the Duke. Yet now it seemed she had set her sights on little Bo instead. As he spoke, the butler clenched his fists with righteous indignation. His young mistress was still such an innocent child. How could that madwoman of an emperor bring herself to harm her? Listening to the butler's unfiltered scolding of the emperor, little Bo froze on the spot. Insulting the emperor was a capital offense, and the girl couldn't help but feel a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She took a deep breath, and following Roel's lead, began listing off the emperor's faults herself. The butler was a little puzzled by Bo's sudden shift, but in the blink of an eye, the girl had reverted back to her usual timid self, her small frame trembling slightly. Yet she still forced herself to sound brave, declaring that she too was now an accomplice in insulting the emperor. The girl's endearing reaction warmed Roel's heart. But out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a vivid bouquet of daffodils sitting by her bedside. He had no idea who had secretly placed them there, but the butler decided it would be best to dispose of them as soon as possible. Watching the butler's unusual behavior, little Bo fell into thought. Everyone else treated Roel with such deep respect. Perhaps he had some hidden special status she didn't know about. This young girl was about to be taken into the mad old emperor's harem, and though her sister-obsessed brother did everything he could to thwart the empress's scheme, all sorts of uncertain dangers still lurked around little Bo. To protect his sister's safety, Julia specially assigned Kamen, the finest knight in the order, to serve as her personal guard. Little Bo politely greeted the newly arrived young man, and her polite manner instantly won the big brother-like knight over. He casually told his young mistress to just call him by his name. Just as little Bowie hesitated over how to address him, the butler beside her made the very same request. The two of them subtly competing with each other, looking almost like rivals vying for attention. Though she had no idea why they cared so much about how they were addressed, little Bo obediently nodded along. She asked Roel somewhat curiously why her brother had suddenly assigned her a knight. The butler's expression turned grave, and he told the girl that the bouquet of daffodils he'd disposed of earlier had been laced with a vicious curse. And from the looks of it, that bouquet had most likely been sent by the emperor herself. That monstrous empress wasn't just terrifyingly powerful in combat. Her talent for magic was equally jaw-dropping. Little Bo had originally been somewhat worried about her own situation, but hearing the butler curse the noble emperor once more, the girl immediately threw all sense of decorum to the wind and lunged at him. She straddled Roel and clamped her soft little hands firmly over the man's mouth, explaining to Kamen. Beside her, in a panic, Big Brother Butler gets nervous and starts singing like a frog. With that, she even croaked out a couple of ribbits with a perfectly straight face, the girl attempting to bluff her way through with this flimsy excuse. Kamen, playing along, put on a look of exaggerated shock, but wanting to see his friend embarrass himself further. He said with mock seriousness that he wouldn't believe it unless Roel sang the Little Frog song one more time. Seeing his friend's face darken with a storm cloud of irritation, Kamen realized he'd taken the joke a little too far. He crouched down gently and explained to little Bo that the master he served was the Duke, not his Majesty, and it was precisely because the Duke trusted him that he'd been sent to protect the young lady. The man joked good-naturedly with little Bo Hay, while the butler beside them huffed that he'd end up corrupting their young mistress with jokes like that. Watching the two of them bicker and tease each other without giving an inch, little Bo couldn't help but break into a happy smile with them around. Even if the enemy was as terrifying as the Emperor herself, she wouldn't be afraid. Yet the girl had no idea that an even greater conspiracy was quietly waiting for her. The girl never imagined she'd nearly been killed by her best friend. Just moments ago, little Bo had still been searching everywhere for any trace of Julian. Even though the two of them had kept up their correspondence this whole time, the girl couldn't help but miss the considerate boy. To see him, little Bo had specially dressed herself in an exquisite gown, looking every bit like a princess out of a fairy tale. And she'd eagerly gone to every spot the boy usually frequented. But after searching all morning, there was still no sign of Julian anywhere. Perhaps he had matters of his own to attend to, just as her brother had been busy sparring with the scheming empress lately. Though she desperately wished her brother could spare some time for her, she understood all too well that everything the Duke did, he did for her sake. With that thought, warmth filled little Bo's heart. Her brother might look cold and distant on the outside, but inside he was gentler than anyone. No wonder he received so many love letters. Curious, the girl asked the man beside her why the Emperor was so fixated on the Ectonia family. Kamen, sensing his young mistress's confusion, patiently explained. The Duke was one of only 5 remaining Grand Spirit Masters in the world. And beyond that, he also controlled one of the Empire's most vital economic lifelines. 70% of the continent's spirit stones came from the Ectonia family, and influence of that magnitude was more than enough to make the royal family wary. Listening to Kamen's praise of her brother, little Bo's eyes filled with admiration. So her brother was truly this remarkable a person. Yet the more she realized this, the more inferior little Bo he felt. After all, she was still just a pitiful war orphan. If it hadn't been for a stroke of luck, she might have been sold off long ago. With that thought, the girl lowered her head in sorrow. But out of the corner of her eye, she spotted a letter that had fallen to the ground at some point. The familiar handwriting made her eyes light up. It was a letter of greeting from Julian. Without a second thought, the girl tucked the letter away, completely unaware that danger was quietly closing in. Before long, it was time for bed, and little Bo suddenly remembered the letter she'd picked up earlier that day. Wondering how Julian had been faring in the night order, she eagerly tore open the envelope, only to find a single line of strange text on the paper inside. The beautiful, flowing script giving off an eerie glow. As if under a spell, the girl read the incantation aloud. In an instant, a seductive, silver-haired woman appeared before her. This girl's body had been stolen by the wicked emperor, and all she could do was watch helplessly as she climbed into her brother's bed. Little Bohi never imagined that Julian's letter could carry a hypnotic curse. As the seductive woman materialized out of thin air, her consciousness grew hazier and hazier, and by the time the girl woke up again, her body was no longer under her own control. All little Bohi could do was watch helplessly as the Empress ran amok wearing her body, and it had to be said, the fake Bohi's acting was masterful. The night-standing night watch had no suspicion whatsoever, and simply led her straight to the Duke's room. But unfortunately, no one could hear the real Beau's voice. Little Bohi couldn't help but worry about her brother's safety, though she didn't know exactly what the Emperor intended by occupying her body. Her instincts told her that her brother might be in danger. Watching the Empress stride into her brother's chambers as if it were the most natural thing in the world, little Bohe had no choice but to follow close behind. But the moment she stepped inside, she saw the fake Bohe put on a tearful, pitiful expression, apologizing to Julius as if the girl had done something wrong, even letting a single crystalline tear fall as she spoke. The real little Beau beside her felt utterly hopeless. She would never go crying to her brother over something so trivial. Just as little Bohe was trying to figure out how to return to her own body, the Empress abruptly dropped her earlier delicate act. She perched seductively on the edge of the desk, her innocent little face now wearing a coy, alluring smile, every flicker of expression enough to steal a man's breath away. Sensing something was off, Julius frowned in displeasure. But the Empress only pressed herself closer against the man's chest, and little Bohe, horrified by the uncomfortable scene unfolding before her, couldn't bear to watch, thinking despairingly that her brother was surely going to end up hating her after this. To her surprise, Julius had actually already guessed that the girl before him wasn't his little princess. Calmly, he asked the mischievous Empress what exactly she wanted from him, showing up in the dead of night. The fake Bohe gave no direct answer, instead continuing to play the part of an innocent child, urging Julius to send her into the palace. Watching the two of them put on this charade of false sentiment, little Beau felt an overwhelming sense of humiliation and fury. Heaven only knew how mortifying it was to watch herself flirt shamelessly with the brother she admired most. Fortunately, her brother had seen through the Empress's scheme in time, and from their exchange, little Beau pieced together roughly what the Emperor's plan had been in trying to recruit the Duke. But she never imagined that, having failed to negotiate, the Emperor would try to use her own body to kill her brother. The girl, robbed of her body by the wicked Emperor, could only watch helplessly as she was made to murder the brother she loved most. Though the fake Bogue's performance had been masterful, Julius saw through it at a glance. But to keep his sister from being hurt, he had no choice but to keep playing along with the Empress's act. But this scheming, black-hearted emperor had no intention of letting such a rare opportunity slip away. With practiced allure, she cornered the man against the bed, deliberately asking in a coquettish tone whether it was because he'd fallen for her when she was younger that he'd broken off his engagement with the princess. Watching the Empress spout nonsense while wearing her own face, little Beau blushed furiously with embarrassment. But to her surprise, her brother deliberately dodged the Empress's question. The man seized the fake Bohe's hands and, with an expressionless face, laid out his stance of neutrality. He assumed that the Empress, having failed to negotiate, would simply back off. But Julius never expected the wicked Emperor to come up with a scheme to take them both down together. Just then, a massive silver serpent slithered slowly out of her mouth, coiling around like a predator locking down its prey, clamping down mercilessly on the Duke's throat. The man frowned faintly, pressed down by the sheer force of her power. But to avoid harming his sister's body, all he could do was rely on sheer willpower to withstand the Empress's assault. Watching Julius struggle, the fake Boe's lips curled into a wicked, bewitching smile. She aimed a sharp hairpin at herself and, in an arrogant tone, declared that if the Duke didn't help secure her throne, she would spill this innocent girl's blood right then and there. Little Beau assumed her brother would never agree to such an unreasonable demand, but to her shock, the man agreed without a moment's hesitation. The girl's eyes went wide with shock. She hadn't realized just how much she meant to her brother. But the thought of her brother being forced, because of her, into doing something he didn't want to do, left little Beau feeling unbearably distressed. It had always been her brother protecting her. This time, it was her turn to protect him. With that thought, the small, frail girl made a bold decision. She screamed at the Empress to get out of her body. In an instant, a violent surge of black mist swept through like a raging storm, and this terrifying force made even the powerful Empress shudder. She had only ever heard of anything like it on the battlefield years ago. A mysterious power capable of leveling an entire nation. Forced into retreat, the Empress had no choice but to withdraw for the time being. And little Bohee finally reclaimed her own body. But the very next second, a torrent of blood surged from her mouth. The girl had bitten through her own tongue to save the brother she loved. Little Bo had reclaimed her body through sheer force of will, wresting it back from the Empress, yet deep within her soul, she sensed a lingering presence that wasn't her own. Perhaps the wicked Emperor was merely lying low for now. But determined not to let her brother be threatened again, she resolved to drive this woman out of her body once and for all. The clever girl remembered the Empress's threatening words earlier, that right now she and the mad Emperor shared the same pain. With that thought, little Bo's gaze hardened with resolve, and she bit down fiercely on her own tongue. Only then did the Empress realize the girl's reckless act, and cursing inwardly, she severed her connection to the body at once. The unfamiliar presence vanished completely, and little Bo knew she had succeeded. But the searing pain in her tongue left her unable to speak, and dark blood soaked the sheets. His little princess was dying. Julius stared, stunned at the scene before him, letting out an anguished, tortured roar, while little Bohee felt the sounds around her growing fainter and fainter, her body growing heavy as if sinking into a bottomless lake. In her mind, another eerie voice surfaced, mocking her cowardice and helplessness, as if trying to drag the dying girl down into the abyss. "Stop it! Get out of my head!" Little Bo struggled in agony, and when she opened her eyes, she found Mr. Roll gazing at her, his expression full of anxious worry, the man's face pale and haggard. But the moment he saw the girl wake, his face immediately lit up with relief. Little Bo was still a little disoriented. She vaguely remembered biting her tongue to drive the Empress out. Yet now her tongue seemed completely intact without even the faintest scar. She couldn't help but wonder if that entire night had just been some strange dream. But the butler's words left little Bo utterly stunned. Everything that had happened the night before had been real. The girl really had bitten straight through her own tongue. Roll felt both furious and heartbroken. How could his young mistress disregard her own safety so completely? If he'd arrived just a little later, this obedient girl would already have become a cold corpse. Faced with the butler's reproach, little Bohee could only apologize helplessly. It was her own carelessness that had given the Emperor an opening, and had very nearly put her brother in grave danger. The girl trailed off, lowering her head, but instead of scolding her, she felt a warm, large hand gently stroke the crown of her head. Roll spoke softly, comforting little Bo, telling her none of this was her fault, his rich, soothing voice dissolving all of her unease. Little Bo still had no idea that her enraged brother was about to unleash his vengeance on the wicked Empress, his sister forced to bite her own tongue nearly to death. The furious brother resolved to unleash his vengeance on the wicked Empress. Ignoring the guards' attempts to stop him, Julius marched straight through to the Empress's chambers, and with a resounding crash, the thick door shattered, leaving a hole over 2 meters high. Julius strode in as if no one else existed, his overwhelming presence leaving the guards too frightened to even try to stop him. Before the Empress could get a word in, the man let out an icy, mocking laugh, taunting the Emperor without a shred of restraint. He hadn't expected that even she had days when fear of pain would send her running from a fight. Aware she was in the wrong, the Emperor quietly tried to change the subject. But her nonchalant attitude only further stoked Julius's fury. His sister had nearly died because of the Empress's cruel prank, and yet here this woman was, sitting around calmly sipping tea as if nothing had happened. With that thought, Julius smashed the chair beneath him in half with a single strike, sending shards of stone flying like arrows straight toward the Empress's throne. And the atmosphere instantly turned razor sharp, yet the Emperor showed no sign of anger. Calmly, she asked Julius whether the girl was still alive. Otherwise, she said, given the Duke's notoriously vengeful nature, she'd already be dead herself by now. The Empress took an unhurried sip of her red tea, a look of smug victory spreading across her face. If her guess was correct, Julius must have called on the power of a mage to heal his sister. And according to their long-standing agreement, mages were forbidden from using magic anywhere outside the temple, meaning the Duke's actions had already dealt serious damage to the relationship between the Ectonia family and the temple. The Empress couldn't help but feel pleased with herself. She had originally only intended to use little Bohei as leverage to force the Duke into signing a contract, but never imagined the girl's injury would end up forcing the Duke onto the same side as her, exactly the outcome she'd been hoping for. The Emperor teased the man mockingly, asking if, just as the rumors claimed, he had a preference for young children. And unsurprisingly, this remark struck a nerve deep within Julius. The man slammed his fist down in fury, instantly shattering the chair beneath him into pieces. He couldn't stand for anyone to insult his little princess like that. Yet the Empress kept up her hypocritical smile, and before she could even give an order, a fully armored man materialized behind Julius like a phantom, his spirit-wreathed sword letting out a sharp, ringing hum the moment it clashed. Two masters of swordsmanship from different generations were about to cross blades. The calculating Empress hurried forward to break up the fight. Provoking Julius right now would be an extremely unwise move, and to secure her throne, she had no choice but to temporarily concede. The Empress offered the Duke boundless power and wealth in exchange, but Julius coldly refused her. All the man wanted right now was to make the Empress taste the same agony of a severed tongue that his sister had suffered. Just how terrifying can a sister-obsessed brother's fury be? To avenge his sister, Julius was ready to break ties entirely. Coldly, he stated he could accept cooperating with the royal family, but only on the condition that the Empress cut out her own tongue as compensation. The man smirked coldly, knowing full well the Empress had no choice but to concede given the current balance of power. Sure enough, the deranged woman spat out a bloody chunk of flesh from her mouth, calmly handing over the severed half of her tongue to Julius. But the Empress's attempt to placate him did nothing to please the Duke. The moment he took the mangled piece of flesh, he crushed it instantly, warning the Empress never to set her sights on little Bose again, or he wouldn't hesitate to declare war at any moment. By the time Julius returned to the estate, it was nearly evening, the setting sun's glow spilling over little Bo, and the girl looked timidly at her brother, but before the apology she'd prepared could even leave her lips, the man reached out first to gently pinch his sister's soft cheek. He tenderly told little Bo to say, "Ah," then proceeded to carefully examine her injury from every angle. Having her tongue handled so casually by the brother she adored left the shy girl blushing all the way to her fingertips, and at such close proximity she couldn't help but worry he might notice the lingering taste in her mouth. Fortunately, the examination didn't take long, and Julius gently wiped away the moisture at the corner of the girl's lips, reminding his sister as he did that the tongue was the most sensitive part of the entire body. If the estate hadn't happened to have a mage on hand to treat her, she might well have died right in front of him. His brother's tone suddenly turned grave, which frightened little Bohey enough to swallow hard, tears welling in her eyes. Seeing this, Julius couldn't bring himself to scold her further, and with a helpless sigh, he turned to invite the girl over for something to eat. But little Bohey mistook his turn back for disappointment. Helplessly, she apologized. It was her own carelessness that had let her brother fall victim to the Empress's spell, and her own foolishness that had nearly gotten her killed. And all of this, she believed, stemmed from her failure to trust the brother she loved. Back when she'd been kidnapped, Julius had told her to trust the head of the Ectonia family, that no matter where she was, he would go to any length to save her. Little Bove lowered her head in shame. She had forgotten her brother's vow. His sister, robbed of her own body by the wicked emperor, yet with her brother right there beside her, had still chosen to resolve the crisis by hurting herself instead. And a deep sense of failure welled up inside Julius. His little princess hadn't trusted him. The man couldn't help but wonder if he'd failed as a brother. But he never expected that his sister would be the one apologizing to him over this. Tears welling in the girl's eyes, all of the anger Julius had built up instantly melted away. He turned and walked over to stand before his sister. Trying his best to appear gentle, he told her that if the emperor wanted to finalize their agreement, she would need to summon her true form, and he planned to use that moment to drive the emperor out for good. Little Bo felt her heart clench. It was her own overconfidence that had let things spiral this far. Julius could sense his sister's inner struggle and continued, "If the emperor fails this time, she'll only keep coming after you in the future. So it's actually a good thing to settle this once and for all." The man deliberately raised his voice, telling little Bo that even if he ended up signing an agreement with the emperor, it would be his own decision, and that in his heart, nothing mattered more than his sister. With that, Julius knelt on one knee before the girl, like a knight before his liege. "Is it really impossible for me to earn your trust?" His voice was like a low, resonant cello, gradually soothing away the girl's unease. She wanted desperately to tell her brother that it wasn't like that at all. It was her brother who had pulled her out of hell and given her a life of comfort and a family who cherished her. But another voice in her mind kept arguing back that every time danger struck, she always insisted on handling it herself, never once stopping to think how devastated her brother would be if she ever died. Little Bo clenched her hands tightly, unable to bring herself to meet her brother's eyes. She was a useless child. Just like this time, when she'd been possessed by the Empress. She hadn't been able to help at all, only burdening everyone around her. But she wanted so badly to be recognized by her brother. Otherwise, what right did she have to remain by the Duke's side? Her voice choked with emotion. She told her brother that she wanted to become someone useful to him, that none of this was his fault. It was her own recklessness. The girl had braced herself for her brother's reproach. But instead, Julius carefully unfolded her clenched hands. His golden eyes brimming with tenderness, he told her he had never expected anything else of her. No matter what she was like, he loved her just the same. No reasons needed. None required. This confession made the girl forget her tears entirely. She stared at her brother in a daze, and he returned her gaze with genuine sincerity. If I really do have one expectation, it's that you live a healthy life. In that instant, little Bo felt as though the whole world had burst into color. Her eyes brimmed with tears, not from sorrow or grievance, but from pure happiness. The girl's small frame threw itself into her brother's arms, sobbing loudly as if releasing years of pent-up hurt all at once. Julius couldn't help but shudder, and somewhat stiffly he patted his sister's back. No one could say how long it took, but eventually, little Bo cried herself out and quietly nestled into her brother's embrace. The warmth of it felt just like being cradled in her mother's arms once again. The girl still didn't realize that her feelings for her brother had already quietly begun to change. She was the beloved little princess adored by all, yet her childhood had been a living hell. For as long as little Bo could remember, she had been locked away in a remote orphanage, and the slightest disobedience would earn her a brutal beating from the director. One night, amid a heavy snowstorm, a drunken man sat comfortably by the fireplace. But the moment he caught sight of little Bo, he flew into a rage, cursing her viciously for ruining his mood. And the timid girl could only kneel and beg for mercy over and over. Yet even so, she was still shut outside in the freezing cold. The girl apologized helplessly, but the man's room had already filled with the sound of his snoring. In despair, she thought she was going to die when she heard a faint, soft meow in the corner. It turned out to be a half-frozen kitten. The girl used what little warmth her own body had left to keep it warm. Perhaps huddled together, they still couldn't fend off the bone-chilling wind, but at least they could face the god's embrace together. She didn't know how much time had passed before a stranger appeared in front of little Bo. The man shielded her from the raging blizzard, but the girl, on the verge of freezing to death, simply kept her head down and said nothing. She knew she was a useless child, and that maybe only in death would she stop being a burden to others. The girl instinctively hugged herself tighter, while the man had already taken the long-dead kitten from her arms. Little Bo lifted her head in a daze, barely able to feel her own body anymore. Perhaps before long, her soul too would leave this cruel world behind. The girl waited in despair for death to come, but instead she unexpectedly saw a ray of warm sunlight. Stiffly, she raised her head only to see the kitten, already dead, affectionately nuzzling the man's cheek. A gentle voice spoke above her. Our God would never abandon us. Little Bo suddenly jolted awake from her dream. It had been a long time since she'd last dreamed about the orphanage. Perhaps it was the conversation with her brother earlier that day that had stirred it back up. The girl had always believed that being hypnotized by the Empress was entirely her own fault. But her brother's words had opened her eyes. She shouldn't blame herself for every mistake, or believe that disappearing would solve all her problems. These were nothing more than ways of running away. Just as the orphanage director's abuse had never been her fault, and that vile man had already received the punishment he deserved. It was only now that little Bo understood. Her brother had always been teaching her about life in his own way. Perhaps Julius wasn't good at expressing himself, but in little Bo's heart, he was the best brother in the entire world. With that thought, the girl prepared to get out of bed, but she felt a damp, sticky sensation on the hem of her skirt. Confused, she lifted the blanket, only to find dried bloodstains already soaked into her clothes. Her skirt was stained with blood, and little Bo feared she'd come down with some terrible illness. But when her maid saw it, she looked delighted instead. It turned out this was simply the monthly cycle every girl experienced once she reached a certain age. and its arrival meant she had truly become a woman. She'd been worried about her young mistress's health before, but it seemed the careful nourishment of these past months had done her good, which really was a wonderful thing. Though all of this was completely beyond little Beau's understanding, she had always believed that children were delivered by the goddess Tamara, which was exactly why she'd asked her brother how many children he planned to have someday. The girl blushed with embarrassment, while the maid beside her burst out laughing at her young mistress's innocent reaction. She told the girl to keep herself warm over the coming days, then went off to prepare a soft nightgown and a warm hot water bottle. It was only then that little Bohei noticed the heavy, aching sensation in her lower belly, with a dull soreness in her lower back as well. And she had no choice but to obediently lie back down. Meanwhile, the maid immediately reported the young lady's condition to the Duke, and asked if he could arrange for some fresh flowers to be prepared into medicine. The moment he heard, the Duke grew anxious about his sister's health. But the maid waved her hand reassuringly, telling him there was nothing wrong with the young lady. Her period arriving was actually a sign that her body was getting healthier. Finding fresh flowers in winter would admittedly be difficult, but since they were for his sister, he could have the mage try to conjure some, even if it risked displeasing the temple. As long as it made his sister happy, he was willing to do anything. Just then, night came and suddenly burst in, announcing in alarm that the temple had sent people to conduct an inspection, and that their purpose was to question the ducal household about the mage's earlier unauthorized healing of the young lady. Julius's expression instantly turned dark and menacing, the pen in his hand snapping in half from the force of his grip. If those temple scum thought they could still lay claim to the Ectonia family, then they'd better be prepared for what came next. Julius, leading a group of holy knights, arrived at the castle gates, where a stranger dressed as a priest had already been waiting for some time. The moment he saw the Duke, the man spoke up in an arrogant tone, "Feel free to settle your little personal matter." Julius's expression remained stony throughout. If it weren't for his sister, he would have taken the man's head off right there on the spot. Compared to everything the temple had done to him in the past, sparing this holy emperor from being hacked to pieces was already an act of considerable mercy. The girl's body was still bleeding, yet her brother and the temple were on the verge of war. At this critical moment, little Beau had no choice but to step forward. Because of her period, her body was still a little weak, but not wanting her brother to be falsely accused by the Grand Priest, the girl decided to shoulder the entire blame herself. Gracefully lifting the hem of her skirt, she politely introduced herself as the young lady of the Duke's house, her commanding presence immediately catching the Grand Priest's attention. The temple's proxy. The man extended his hand toward little Beau with false courtesy, but seeing this, Julius immediately stepped between the two of them. Disgusted, he had no intention of letting this filthy man lay a single finger on his precious sister. The Duke's cold attitude instantly enraged the arrogant Grand Priest. He furiously slammed his staff against the ground, glaring as he berated the man. "Your current position hardly allows for such disrespect." Julius grew even more furious, the veins on the back of his hand bulging. That these scum, who had caused his parents' deaths, would dare to barge so brazenly into the ducal estate meant they'd better be prepared to die right here. With that thought, a ruthless plan formed in his mind, and Julius turned coldly to tell the Grand Priest that he could accept the inspection, but only on the condition that the man conducted entirely by himself, and within just 3 days. Though furious, the Grand Priest had no choice but to grudgingly agree. Completely unaware of any of this, little Beau couldn't help but wonder why her brother despised the temple so much. And once back at the estate, she immediately sought out Common to learn the truth of what had happened all those years ago. From the man, she learned that the temple had once tried to seize control of the Ectonia family's spirit stone mines, but the old Duke had refused to conspire with those charlatans, and in a fit of humiliated rage, the temple had struck back in secret. They lured the Duke under the pretense of a mysterious ceremony, then ambushed him along the way with dozens of bloodthirsty cultist assassins. On that freezing, snowy night, a young Julius had watched helplessly as his beloved family died right before his eyes. Even Cayman wasn't entirely sure how he'd survived that day. But after that incident, the Ectonia family had severed all ties with the temple for good. It was said that after the tragedy, the temple had blamed the whole affair on nothing more than the bad luck of Julius's parents. And since there was no evidence to prove otherwise, the matter had simply been left unresolved. Hearing this, little Beau was furious. She wished she could stand in for her brother and teach that androgynous priest a lesson himself. The girl was filled with regret. If only she'd known about her brother's past sooner, she never would have gone to greet the man so recklessly. But Kamen gave her a playful wink, telling little Bo that she'd looked incredibly cool back there, as if declaring to their aggressor that the Ectonia family would never fall so easily. Comforted, the girl still covered her ears in a sulk. She had no idea yet that, when facing her brother's enemy, this once timid girl would soon fall completely into darkness. Just a little while ago, little Bowie had still been agonizing over whether she should apologize to her brother for what happened the day before. She hadn't meant to interrupt Julius's revenge on purpose. It was only because the situation had been so urgent that she'd stopped the Duke from going to war with the temple. The girl rubbed her aching lower back in frustration. Worried her brother might still be upset with her, she'd barely slept the night before, and the one to blame for all of it was that thoroughly detestable Grand Priest. But to her surprise, the shameless man actually came looking for her on his own. Carlito flashed a hypocritical smile and warmly tried to strike up conversation with the girl. But his oily, unctuous manner made little Bo's stomach churn, and she had to force herself not to let her disgust show. Yet this repulsive man just kept clinging to her, insisting on chatting, and even offered to perform some astonishing magic to show off to the girl. Little Bo froze for a moment. According to the rules, mages weren't permitted to use magic anywhere outside the temple. So what gave this man in front of her the right to do as he pleased? After hearing the girl's question, Carleto let out a scornful laugh, declaring that a man as enlightened as himself had no need to be bound by petty rules, his haughty expression carrying a look of utter contempt. Little Bowie was instantly infuriated by the man's blatant double standards, and with a hollow look in her eyes, she looked up and asked him to perform a magic trick that would make him disappear from the ducal estate entirely. The girl's undisguised disdain, rather than offending the priest, only piqued his interest further. With a smirk, he praised little Bo's commendable courage, then produced a strange, eerie-looking ring, and in an instant a bright light flared up around the two of them. The man gripped the girl's shoulders in a vice-like hold, intending to spirit little Bo straight out of the ducal estate. Setting aside how uncomfortable it was to see through this display of sibling affection between the two of them, Julius's clear devotion to his sister alone was enough for them to use the girl as a hostage, as leverage against the Duke. Yet the Grand Priest could sense an eerie surge of magical power radiating from little Bo, a force so strong it sent a chill down even his spine. But greedy as he was, there was no way he'd give up such easy prey. According to temple doctrine, magic was a gift bestowed upon humanity by the gods. And someone like little Boe, born with innate magical power, rightfully belonged to the temple, so no matter what, he was determined to take the girl away. But just then, a blade materialized out of thin air and pressed against the man's throat. At the critical moment, Kamen had drawn his sword, thwarting Carleto's scheme to offer the girl up as a sacrifice to the Holy Emperor. The hot-tempered man was instantly enraged, furiously warning Kamen that such an act would bring down the temple's curse upon him. But the brave young knight stood firmly in front of little Bo, refusing to yield an inch. Seeing the standoff reach an impasse, the vile priest resorted to invoking the temple's authority to pressure the ducal household, his eyes turning increasingly sinister, as he ordered little Bo, in a commanding tone, to submit to an examination. Possessing magical power meant becoming a slave to the temple, and even a member of the Ectonia family was no exception. With that, Carlito strode forward quickly, intending to forcibly drag little Bo away. The man had calculated that Kamen wouldn't dare act against him, but he never expected the sharp edge of the sword to slash viciously across his hand. The priest recoiled in pain, and in his humiliated fury, he unleashed a magical attack on Kamen. The young man's face immediately erupted in searing, unbearable pain, but even so, he still stood firmly, shielding little Bohe behind him. Unless he died, no one would be allowed to harm his young mistress. Carlito was about to keep berating the knight before him, but the fearless little Bo had already stepped forward on her own, declaring boldly that the priest had struck first, and that she refused to submit to any magical examination whatsoever. The girl's firm resolve left the priest with no choice but to back down tactically, though his heart still seethed with unspent fury. Just then, Julian, who had just finished training, happened to pass by the corridor, and from a distance he saw the girl he loved being badly mistreated. The young man's eyes narrowed dangerously, just as he was weighing how best to get revenge on this overbearing priest. Carlito, of all people, called Julian over. The priest deliberately picked a fight, hoping to vent his pent-up frustration, but little did he know, His actions were playing right into the young man's hands. The man slammed his staff down hard against the ground, but Julian simply shifted slightly to the side, easily dodging the attack, which only enraged the priest further. By now, Julian had already braced himself for a full counterattack. Feigning indifference, he told the man to just go ahead and hit him. He wouldn't dodge. Sure enough, facing the priest's fist, Julian didn't so much as flinch, but the pain he expected never came instead. The girl he loved crumpled straight to the ground in front of him, her beautiful face streaked with blood. The lovely girl had been disfigured by the priest. Blood trickled down little Beau's cheek, dripping to the floor drop by drop. And seeing this, Carlito began to panic too. Yet, unrepentant to the end, he immediately shifted all the blame onto little Beau, completely failing to notice that a grim-faced Julius had already appeared right behind him. The man's ice-cold voice instantly extinguished the priest's earlier arrogance, and it was then that the Duke noticed the traces of blood still on Carlito's ring. "So it was you." With a resounding crash, the once overbearing priest was sent slamming brutally into the wall. Watching Carlito sprawled on the ground looking for his missing teeth gave little Bohi an immense sense of satisfaction. But this man was, after all, the temple's representative, and if anything happened to him at the ducal estate, it wouldn't be easy to explain away. Cammon, standing nearby, shared the same concern, and he carefully urged the Duke to calm down. But by now, Julius had already lost all reason over his sister's sake. His little princess had been injured and left bleeding, and blood demanded blood in return. He viciously hauled the battered priest up off the ground. But the man, still unrepentant, kept threatening to make the ducal household pay for this. And before Carlito could even use magic to heal himself, Julius's fist came swinging once more, straight at that punchable face of his. The man collapsed to the ground, barely breathing. If no one stepped in, the Duke would have beaten him to death right then and there. Cammon had no choice but to raise his voice, reminding him that the young lady was still standing right there watching. The thought of his sister's worried expression finally pulled Julius back to his senses, if only barely. Gently, he knelt before the girl and, with a pained expression, used his thumb to wipe away the blood on her cheek. "Looks like this is going to leave a scar. Does it hurt?" Little Beau quickly shook her head, smiling as she comforted her brother. "It doesn't hurt, and even if it does scar..." Little did she know, her forced optimism only made Julius's heart ache even more. The furious brother was on the verge of completely losing control. But fortunately, Mr. Roll, the butler, arrived just in time, and little Beau immediately shot him a pleading, desperate look. To her surprise, the butler instead asked the Duke why the Grand Priest still wasn't dead yet, and as he spoke, he tightened the leather gloves on his hands, clearly preparing to finish the job himself. Having personally witnessed his beloved sister disfigured, the enraged brother chose to let himself go completely. Carlito's skull was nearly crushed under Julius's blows, yet the stubborn man, refusing to back down even now, staggered back up and demanded belligerently whether the Duke intended to stage a rebellion. Julius immediately shot back with a cold smile. "Have you forgotten? I quite enjoy a good fight." His expression turned terrifyingly grim, enough to bring back the Grand Priest's memory of that bloody incident in the forest a decade ago. That expressionless young boy, drenched head to toe in blood, had single-handedly killed several towering grown men. At the time, Julius had looked like a demon straight out of hell. And now, once again, he was showing that same terrifying side of himself. A relentless barrage of lethal blows rained down on the Grand Priest. And battered and bruised, all he could do was defend passively. Just as Julius's fist was about to slam into his face, the panicked Carlito fired back with an eerie orb of magical light. But he had no idea that such an ordinary spell was no match at all for the Duke. Blinded by rage, Julius simply swatted it aside with one hand, and the massive orb shattered instantly into countless fragments. But the scattered magical shards, out of anyone's control, went hurtling straight toward little Bowie. At the critical moment, Mr. Roll stepped in front of the girl, decisively raising his right hand, and instantly, a transparent protective barrier enveloped everyone within it. It was only then that little Beau realized the unassuming butler was, in fact, a highly revered mage. No wonder he'd been the first person she saw after her tongue had been bitten through. And no wonder everyone in the ducal estate, regardless of rank, addressed him respectfully as Mr. Little Beau felt a pang of shame at her own ignorance. But she could still hear the sounds of fighting outside the barrier growing even more intense. Just as she was debating whether to go help her brother, the chaotic noise abruptly cut off. The girl held her breath in tension, only to see her brother calmly emerge from the swirling dust. dragging the once arrogant Grand Priest behind him like a dead dog. In the end, the Duke decided to spare the man. He didn't want his little princess to witness such a bloody scene. But once his anger had cooled, Julius's attention turned entirely to his sister. A wound this deep, what would they do if it left a scar? Though they were siblings in name only, her brother doted on her like a lover, willing to pit the entire family against the temple without a second thought. Julius had the barely breathing Grand Priest thrown onto a cart full of manure. Though he hadn't beaten Carlito to death, this was more than enough to leave the once arrogant temple thoroughly humiliated. Once he'd calmed down, the man finally noticed that the wound on his sister's face still hadn't been treated, and he immediately had Roll use magic to heal little Boe. The moment the butler received the order, he knelt in front of the girl, gently instructing his young mistress to close her eyes. Then a soft, holy light burst forth from the man's hands. Little Boe felt a warmth spreading across her cheek, as if some invisible force were helping her wound heal on its own. Was this the legendary healing magic? The girl recalled that the Grand Priest had also mentioned earlier that she too carried magical power within her. Just as the girl was mulling over whether that claim could be true, Roll had already finished the treatment. The girl's lovely face had returned to its flawless, porcelain-smooth state, but the still worried butler kept checking her over, asking repeatedly whether she'd been hurt anywhere else. Little Boe quickly shook her head. Tense, in truth, she was far more worried about her brother's condition than her own. That night, little Boe unsurprisingly found herself unable to sleep. The Duke had gotten into a serious fight with the priest on her account, and even though her brother had clearly come out on top the whole time, the girl still couldn't stop worrying that he might have been hurt. And after the Grand Priest left, her brother hadn't gotten any rest either, rushing back instead to deal with official business. With that thought, little Boe felt an urgent longing to see her brother. And so, escorted by the Night Watch Knight, the girl made her way to the door of his office. She gently pushed open the door, only to end up disturbing Julius, who was hard at work. The man raised an eyebrow, displeased, but the moment he saw it was his sister, his tone immediately softened. "Can't sleep?" The girl nodded obediently. Her brother's desk was piled high with documents like a small mountain, and the empty chair newly placed in the office seemed to be waiting for some kind of guest. Little Boe couldn't help but regret her impulsive visit. If the Duke had to deal with all this because of her, then perhaps her brother might have gotten a bit more sleep otherwise. She then saw Julius come stand in front of her, his outstretched hands seeming as though he meant to gently lift her up. But after hesitating for a few seconds, the man withdrew his hands instead. Little Boe was a little puzzled by her brother's unusual behavior, but she didn't press the matter further, unaware that her brother's former fiancé had already arrived downstairs. His own sister had suddenly started looking like a young woman, and her brother had no choice but to pull back his outstretched arms. Julius found himself nostalgic for the days when he could freely scoop little Boe up and carry her around. Back then, his sister had been nothing more than a tiny bundle, but now she had grown into a young lady of marriageable age. With that thought, the sister-obsessed man felt a wistful pang in his chest. He tried hard to keep his focus on the documents in his hands, but then he heard his sister's soft, sweet voice. "We won't end up going to war with the temple, will we?" Julius's pen froze mid-stroke. He didn't want to break this harsh truth to his sister, but he knew all too well that a clash with the temple was inevitable. Seeing his sister's alarmed expression, Julius couldn't help but soften his tone, telling her that even if war did break out, it wouldn't be her fault. But to his surprise, little Bo's voice began to waver with the threat of tears. What she cared about wasn't whether there would be a war at all, but whether her brother might get hurt because of it. Watching his sister's tearful expression, Julius gently patted the top of her head, his gentle gaze seeming to tell little Bo not to worry. But the sensitive girl could still read the hatred toward the temple in her brother's expression. Perhaps if the conversation continued, her brother's mood would only worsen. So the quick-witted little Bohe promptly changed the subject, asking her brother about the matter of magical power. If what the Grand Priest had said was true, wouldn't that make her some kind of powerful magical girl? But her brother's answer poured cold water over little Bo's excitement. It turned out that people who could use magic weren't actually all that rare. The real key to becoming a mage was the sheer amount of magical power one carried within. Her brother told her that if she wanted to confirm her magical strength, she could ask Mr. Roll for help. But little Bo obediently shook her head. She had a rough guess that whatever magical power she carried within her was probably quite weak, and honestly, she'd rather not know at all. Besides, as long as she was by her brother's side, She didn't feel she needed magic anyway. With that thought, the girl broke into a sweet smile. But just then, the anxious butler suddenly arrived to announce, "Her Highness the Princess has arrived." Hearing this news, Julius shot to his feet instantly, and even little Bo beside him could sense the wariness radiating from her brother. If she remembered correctly, her brother had once been engaged to this princess. So should she excuse herself for a while? Just as little Bo was preparing to leave, Julius called out to stop her from behind. A duke who loved only his sister was somehow meeting up with his ex in the middle of the night. And even though it was supposed to be a private meeting between the two of them, he was insisting on bringing his sister along. Little Bo was extremely nervous standing there, but more than anything, she felt curious, wanting to know just what kind of woman could possibly be a match for her perfect brother. As the chamber doors slowly swung open, a graceful figure stepped in elegantly, the young woman's silvery white hair shimmering like moonlight, and little Bohe found herself utterly captivated by the sight before her. Thankfully, her brother's timely reminder snapped her out of her daze. The girl quickly lifted the hem of her skirt in a textbook perfect curtsy, greeting Her Highness with composed grace. Her adorably flustered manner instantly made Arabella laugh. Before arriving, she'd heard that Julius had adopted a young war orphan, and sure enough, the girl was every bit as adorable as the rumors had suggested. Well said. Little Bo was surprised by how different the princess felt compared to the deranged empress. She and her brother standing together looked just like a prince and princess out of a fairy tale, while she felt like the ugly duckling standing off to the side, an unexpected wave of inferiority welling up inside the girl. Perhaps it was time for her to make her exit. But to her surprise, her brother had her sit right beside him, and the atmosphere in the room grew strangely awkward. Little Bo fidgeted, clutching nervously at the hem of her dress, as Her Highness affectionately called her brother Yuli, their easy laughter making it seem as though she, and not little Bo, were the true mistress of the ducal estate. But little Bo had no idea that Julius and this former fiancé of his had never shared anything beyond simple friendship. In truth, they'd only ever been partners bound by political interest, and the Duke had kept the girl there purely so his sister wouldn't misunderstand, though it ended up only making little Bohe feel worse instead. Especially given how the princess carried that petite, adorable charm of hers, it almost seemed deliberate, as though meant to make the girl believe there was more than friendship between them. And so, for the first time, Julius abruptly cut off the princess mid-question, asking her point blank what exactly had brought her here so late at night with this visit. The princess, who had been teasing him playfully just moments before, instantly switched to a serious expression, telling the Duke she had come on behalf of the temple to seek a mediation. Julius, too, shifted into a negotiating stance, asking the princess to lay out the terms the temple was proposing. As the tension in the air grew thicker and thicker, little Bo found herself utterly bewildered. She was the heretic everyone wanted to see punished, yet here she was, doted on by her brother like a little princess. Because Julius had deliberately kept her in the dark, little Bo had no idea of her true identity, and to protect the secret of his sister's magical power, the man made sure to add one more condition to the negotiation. If the Ectonia family were ever to produce another mage, the temple would absolutely not be permitted to interfere in any way. In exchange, the Duke would need to issue a formal letter of apology to help the temple save face. The princess had expected Julius to flatly refuse, but to her surprise, the man agreed without a moment's hesitation, and Arabella couldn't help but marvel. In just a year apart, Julius had somehow developed this docile side of him, and the one who changed him was, of all people, a young girl not even fully grown. The princess couldn't resist teasing the man in front of her. So the rumors really were true. You do have a soft spot for small, adorable types. The innocent little Bohe still hadn't quite caught on, while beside her, Julius, as though the remark had struck a little too close to home, snapped in embarrassed irritation, telling the princess not to joke about such things. Yet Arabella pulled little Bogue aside and began chatting with her like close girlfriends sharing secrets, telling the girl that the Grand Duke of the past would never have been this mature and composed back then. Anyone who so much as talked back to him would end up beaten to a pulp. So when she'd first heard that Julius had brought home a little girl from an orphanage, she hadn't believed it at all. But after seeing the warm rapport between the Duke and little Bo today, she finally understood. She was never going to become the mistress of the ducal estate after all. Still, out of curiosity, Arabella asked Julius playfully whether his real intention in adopting little Bohe was actually to groom her as his heir. To her surprise, the man shook his head solemnly, which made little Bo's ears perk up nervously. But the very next moment, Julius's expression softened into tenderness. I only hope that she can live happily. Her brother's words instantly brought little Bose to the verge of tears, moved beyond words, while the princess beside them wore a look of quiet, satisfied relief. The three of them got so caught up talking that they lost all track of time, and from the princess, little Bohee learned all sorts of embarrassing stories from her brother's younger days, so even a Grand Duke as imposing as that had once been quite the handsome young man. Noticing how late it had gotten, Arabella finally boarded her carriage back to the palace, and before she left, Julius kindly reminded her to bring a guard along next time she went out. Arabella, in turn, huffily reminded the Duke that they were no longer engaged to be married, and with that, the swiftly departing carriage gradually vanished into the night. As for the kind-hearted princess, all Julius felt for her was the concern of a friend. It was his own innocent, adorable sister who truly held the top place in his heart. He was the most hardcore little sidekick standing behind the female lead, killing, fighting, petting cats, keeping her company, whatever little Bohee wanted. He would fetch it for her without a moment's hesitation. The moment they stepped outside, little Bo spotted Julian crouched motionless on the ground. And curious, she trotted over to see what had caught his attention. A kitten, barely a month old, came into view, its dull gray fur far from endearing, yet the girl still felt an overwhelming rush of sympathy. Julian explained that because it was blind in one eye, the kitten's mother hadn't come back to check on it in several days. Little Bohee couldn't help feeling for the poor creature, but out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a wisp of soft cat fur clinging to Julian's collar, and she couldn't resist teasing him. Did you secretly bring a kitten home with you? Caught red-handed, the young man guiltily looked away, and little Bo could only sigh helplessly. She didn't want Julian to lose his standing in the Night Order over a single kitten. Yet she couldn't bear to see this tenacious little life freeze to death either. After a moment of inner conflict, the kind-hearted girl finally decided to take the kitten in herself. Looking at its pitiful state, the girl couldn't help but think back to that miserable time at the orphanage. It had been a cold, snowy day much like this one, when she'd nearly frozen to death alone outside the orphanage. And thankfully, a stray cat had kept her company and shared its warmth back then. Fortunately, all of that was in the past now. Little Bo's gaze lingered on Julian. She'd never quite found the right moment before. But now she finally had the courage to tell him that she wasn't actually a noble young lady by birth at all. She was, just like the boy in front of her, once an orphan abandoned by everyone. The reserved young man had no idea what these words meant to his young mistress. But when he looked up, he was met with the girl's radiant smile, a warmth that seemed capable of melting away even the coldest snow. Julian was momentarily stunned, and then he heard little Bo's sweet voice ring in his ears. Let's just focus on becoming happy from now on. The girl's small hand quietly settled over the back of his, as if sealing a vow. Little Bo would become an outstanding young lady, and Julian would become a dashing knight. Time slipped by, and in the blink of an eye, little Bo was already turning 18. Having shed the awkwardness of childhood, she had blossomed into an even more striking beauty, and her impeccable manners and extensive knowledge had made her, in everyone's eyes, the picture of perfection. But at this stage in her life, she now faced an entirely new challenge. Just how beautiful could this girl grow up to be? In the blink of an eye, little Bo had turned 18, her exquisite features making her the dream bride of countless young men across the empire. Yet even this remarkable young lady now found herself troubled by the upcoming ball. Little Bo had lost count of how many times she'd stepped on Roll's foot, and seeing the man's pained expression as he tried to endure it, she felt so guilty she wanted to give up entirely. But the injured butler simply said indulgently that it was fine. There was no need to get discouraged. He patiently guided little Bo through the steps, spinning and twirling across the dance floor, his gentle tone gradually easing the tension from the girl's shoulders. But the very next moment, little Bowie lost her balance and stepped on Roel's foot yet again. And this time the girl completely deflated, her voice choked with frustrated tears. In just 5 short minutes, she'd already stepped on Roel's foot no fewer than 5 times. And even though the ever-patient butler hadn't uttered a single complaint, little Bo simply couldn't bring herself to keep practicing. With no other choice, the man had the girl take a break to the side, while he went to prepare some refreshing tea, and while little Bowie's attention was turned away, Roel quietly healed his own injured foot. Just then, the girl beside him suddenly spoke up. I don't think I'm cut out for dancing. Little Bo lowered her eyes in dejection. This had gone on for a full 6 months now, She couldn't get more than a few steps in without messing up, and even though Roll never said a word of complaint, she was certain he must have grown tired of her by now. But to her surprise, the butler's stern voice rang out behind her. "Do you remember, my lady, that when you first arrived, you started from learning your letters? Back then, you didn't even sleep properly. And now that you've finally earned the qualification to attend a debutante ball, how could you possibly give up now?" Roll gave little Beau a firm, affirming look, generously declaring that someone as remarkable as his young mistress could accomplish absolutely anything she set her mind to. Encouraged, little Beau immediately perked up, declaring indignantly that even if she wore Rowell's feet down to nothing, she would never let the family be disgraced at the ball. The moment she finished speaking, she was startled by her own words. She'd actually said what she was really thinking out loud. "Are you mocking me right now?" The girl looked at the butler beside her with some embarrassment, but to her surprise, Roll's face lit up with visible delight. "You've finally hit your rebellious phase." Little Beau's cheeks instantly turned as red as a ripe apple, and she flustered her way through an explanation, insisting she'd simply been a little anxious, adopting a tone as if she understood everything. In truth, he simply wanted little Bohi to try talking back to him the way she just had, to become a little more confident. A bit of sulking, a bit of temper, after all, their remarkable little princess could outshine any other noble young lady in every way. The devoted little watchdog who loved only Bohi had somehow gotten tangled up with another girl, and this unreasonable commoner young lady was even trying to spend the night with Julian. Having just finished practicing her dance steps, little Beau was about to head back to her room when a maid came rushing over, out of breath, to report that something had happened to Julian. With her heart pounding with worry, little Beau hurried after the maid to the street, and from a distance she could already see a rough-looking man loudly cursing at Julian, while the outnumbered young man could only use words to try to defuse the situation. Seeing this, little Beau strode forward boldly and stepped in front of Julian, shielding him. "Is there something you need from our knight? I'm Beau Ectonia." Seeing that the newcomer was the noble young lady herself, the arrogant man still pressed on aggressively, demanding, "How does your Grand Duke train his knights? He can't even manage something as simple as escorting a commoner home safely?" This only made little Beau angrier. Who was this man to question her brother's competence? Just as the girl was about to snap back, Julian spoke up beside her, explaining the situation with a helpless sigh. He'd simply been in the village running errands as usual, but on his way back, this strange girl had suddenly collapsed against his back for no reason. And now her father was brazenly demanding that he take responsibility for her. After hearing Julian's explanation, little Bowie could already guess that he'd once again run into one of his odd, persistent admirers. As Julian had grown older, his looks had only become more striking, his ruby-red eyes making countless girls fall for him at first sight, and combined with his prestigious status in the Order of Immortal Knights, it was no wonder these commoner girls kept throwing themselves at him. Still, looking at the haughty attitude of this father and daughter pair in front of her, little Beau decided to teach them a small lesson. With a smile, she said, "The members of the Order of Immortal Knights truly are the very best. It's only natural that you'd admire him. So why don't we have the strongest knight in the Order personally escort you two home?" The moment the girl finished speaking, a burly man with arms as thick as tree trunks appeared before everyone, and before the father and daughter could even react, the giant had already hoisted them both up and carried them off toward the other end of the street. Having handled the situation, little Bohé let out a relieved sigh. With Julian following close behind her, this kind of thing had happened more than once already, probably because the Duke had been away from the estate lately. The girl lowered her head in pain. She really did miss her brother terribly, and had no idea how he was faring out on the battlefield. Sensing little Beau's sorrow, the attentive Julian naturally pulled the petite girl into his arms, and his warm chest instantly soothed the turmoil in her heart. Little Bohé relaxed and closed her eyes. Just as Julian had said, her brother would be back soon. Her brother had promised to come home the moment the war ended, yet rumors were already circulating that the Grand Duke had fallen in battle long ago. Little Bohé knew how formidable her brother was. Surely nothing could have happened to him. Yet she couldn't stop herself from worrying. The maid beside her gently tried to comfort her, saying it was probably just the sheer number of monsters at the border that was delaying the Duke's triumphant return. But deep down, the girl still felt a small ache of sadness. Her brother had promised her, after all, that he would dance the very first dance with her at the ball, And now, dressed in her finest, showing off her most beautiful self, the person she'd been waiting for still hadn't come back. Fortunately, Roel arrived just in time to help lift little Beau's spirits again. The moment the man walked in, he noticed the girl's bare, exposed skin, and Roel instantly grew flustered. He absolutely could not allow any other man to set his sights on little Beau. He immediately wrapped a warm cloak around the girl. But apparently that wasn't enough. So Roel fetched several more layers of winter clothing. Only then did he feel it was finally safe. But by now, little Beau was dressed like a bundled-up little bear cub for winter, and the maid standing nearby could no longer bear to watch. Indignant, she declared that it would be far better to argue with Roel than to let the young lady be dressed like this. She was certain to be laughed at by the other girls. So she stood her ground firmly and helped little Bohi change back into her original outfit. When the beautifully dressed girl finally appeared before everyone, all eyes turned immediately to her, and Kamen stood frozen for a long moment before he could bring himself back to his senses. Was this really the same timid little girl he'd once known? He quickly called out to Julian, standing not far off. "Doesn't the young lady look absolutely stunning today?" The reserved young man nodded without expression, and yet his heart was already pounding uncontrollably. It wasn't until the beautiful girl walked past him that Julian finally dared to lift his head and steal a glance. The soft sunlight, gilding little Bowie like gold, was a sight the love-struck young man would never forget for the rest of his life. As the carriage pulled away from the ducal estate under the setting sun, little Bohi's spirits sank once again. Her brother truly was a shameless liar, tears welling in the girl's eyes. She didn't actually care whether Julius could dance with her or not. All she wanted was for him to come home safely. Before long, the carriage arrived at the entrance to the ballroom, and little Beau quickly composed herself. She represented her brother and the Ectonia family here tonight, and she absolutely could not embarrass them at the ball. The girl silently cheered herself on when she heard Julian's steady voice from behind her. "You are the most beautiful, more beautiful than any lady I have ever seen." Little Beau froze for a moment, then broke into a radiant smile. "Thank you, Julian." She wasn't afraid anymore. The moment the girl made her entrance, she instantly became the center of attention, everyone marveling at little Beau's stunning beauty. Yet amid the hushed whispers, there was no shortage of unpleasant remarks as well. The girl couldn't help but feel angry at these slanderous rumors about her brother. But she knew this wasn't the moment to argue back. All she could do was make sure to shine even brighter. With that, little Bohi confidently straightened her posture, just as she'd practiced. And with poise, she took the knight's arm and approached the emperor. The girl offered a composed, dignified bow, and the empress, seated on high, greeted little Bowie with practiced familiarity. "Growing up so healthy, I take it you've been thoroughly doted on by the Grand Duke?" What sounded like an ordinary greeting was, in fact, a veiled insinuation that the girl was the Duke's mistress. Kamen, standing nearby, couldn't help but silently curse this deranged woman. It was this very empress who had nearly gotten his young mistress killed, and now she had the nerve to ask such a shameless question. He glanced anxiously at little Beau. If only the Grand Duke were here. He would never let his little princess suffer such an insult. But with no one to back her up right now, the girl would have to handle this entirely on her own. Camille had assumed his gentle young mistress would simply stay silent. But to his surprise, he could feel her presence growing stronger and stronger by the second, her cold, mocking smile carrying almost a hint of something darkening within her. "That I've been able to grow up so well is entirely thanks to your Majesty's generosity. Thank you for letting me live this long." Watching her young mistress's darkened expression, Kamen felt a chill run down his spine. Was this what Roel had meant by her rebellious phase? But none of this was little Beau's fault. She was furious right now, and rightfully so. The unhinged empress had once used her as leverage to force her brother into serving the royal family, and over these past several years, little Beau had watched it all unfold. While her brother fought bloody battles against savage monsters at the border, this crowd of extravagant, indulgent nobles got to lounge comfortably in luxury. The angrier little Beau grew thinking about it. The more the empress suddenly burst into hearty laughter, remarking with amusement that the girl wasn't wrong. If she had lost that war years ago, little Beau herself might well have ended up a pitiful slave by now. Faced with such a barbed retort, little Beau could only respond with an awkward, cold smile. It was true she hadn't become a slave, but life as a war orphan hadn't been much better. Though it was also thanks to the empress's adoption policies that she had come to meet her brother in the first place. Just as the girl's thoughts wandered, The Empress's gaze shifted toward the crown prince beside her. Perhaps while the Grand Duke was away, she could arrange a favorable engagement for little Beau. With her brother away from home, his sister was almost married off. And to make matters worse, the intended match was none other than the deranged Empress's scheming son. Only meeting the crown prince for the first time today, the unhinged Empress suddenly slapped her forehead and decided to arrange a marriage between the two of them right then and there. I think today is just the perfect day for a proposal. The Empress spoke with practiced familiarity. While little Beau could only respond with a few awkward, forced chuckles, there was no way she wanted this. Not to mention that getting entangled with the royal family right now would only cause trouble for her brother. Just from the Empress's eager attitude alone, there had to be something unspeakable going on behind the scenes. It had to be said little Beau's political instincts were remarkably sharp. The Empress's true goal was to groom her into a pawn to check the Grand Duke. Right now, little Beau hadn't yet awakened that mysterious dark power within her, but there was no telling what might happen down the road, which made an arranged marriage the safest plan for the time being. But now wasn't the time to rush things either, and she gave little Beau a playful wink. Let's leave it at that for today. I'm not quite so wicked as to bully you while the Grand Duke's away. The girl instantly felt as though she'd been toyed with, but continuing to stand her ground would only put her in a more dangerous position. So with a nod of acknowledgement, little Beau promptly excused herself from this troublesome scene. But as she watched the girl's retreating figure grow smaller in the distance, the Empress's expression instantly turned sinister. She shot a cold glance at her son beside her. He had better play along obediently with this marriage arrangement. Otherwise, she wouldn't hesitate to dispose of him just as she had the other princes. Having just reached the resting area, little Beau was already utterly exhausted. Yet another tough battle still awaited her. Under her brother's protection, she'd had almost no contact with anyone outside the ducal estate for a long while, and what she needed to do now was rely entirely on herself to blend into this ball full of nobles. The girl's striking beauty quickly drew the attention of a young man, who seemed to know common, though he only gave him a perfunctory greeting, before turning immediately to approach little Beau. This is the first time Isaac has ever seen such a wonderful girl. I'm Isaac de Cybele. To him, the young woman before him looked like a dazzling jewel, and he couldn't help but want to draw closer. The man attentively fetched her a glass of rich champagne, and eagerly introduced his own sister to her as well. Cameron clenched his fists dangerously. This man clearly had designs on his young mistress, but seeing little Beau's relaxed smile, he reluctantly held his tongue. Before long, a slightly plump young lady came hurrying over, out of breath, her round, chubby face giving her an air of innocent simplicity. Little Beau couldn't help but wonder, could this be the first friend she'd made at the ball? With her brother away at war, his sister was being bullied at the palace, but at least she had finally made a friend at the ball. But the girl had no idea that this seemingly innocent young companion actually harbored a deeply spiteful heart underneath. From the moment she'd seen little Beau chatting with her brother, jealousy had already filled her chest, and a vicious plan had begun to take shape. She warmly linked arms with the girl and, without so much as asking permission, began pulling her toward the other side of the room. Cameron immediately called out to stop them, watching his young mistress's unsteady figure with unease. But Rita firmly rebuffed the suggestion. I'll escort her. This debutante ball is a party held for the young ladies. You dark, hulking men should step aside once your escort duty is done. Camille tried to argue further, but little Beau kindly told him it was fine. She could take care of herself. Even now, little Beau remained genuinely hopeful about meeting other girls her own age. You all go have fun. Even amid the swirl of unfriendly gossip surrounding her, the girl still held her shoulders back firmly, determined to prove to everyone that even with her brother away, she was fully capable of protecting the Ectonia family's honor. The two of them stumbled through the crowd together, and little Beau looked up with joyful anticipation, but the sight of this all-too-familiar face left her frozen in place. Her heart clenched as if gripped by an unseen hand. The girl's eyes held nothing but shock and the sting of betrayal. Azella, for her part, curled her lips into a satisfied smirk. She'd waited a full 3 years for this chance at revenge, and now she meant to make little Beau taste what it felt like to lose everything. The girl lifted her chin arrogantly. Over these past 3 years, she'd made sure every noble young lady knew the story, that back then it was Beau who had shamelessly seduced her own servant. A commoner, daring to dream of becoming a noble, deserves nothing but to become a laughingstock. By now, little Beau had recovered from her shock, But her position here was extremely precarious. If she simply turned and walked away, both her brother and her family would suffer for it in the court of public opinion. Just as she was considering how to strike back, Azella spoke first. "Do you have a habit of stealing other people's things?" That single remark completely ignited little Bohi's fury. She'd warned her once before. Julian wasn't a thing. Her brother had remained unmarried his entire life for the sake of his sister. Yet now that same sister was being slandered as nothing more than his pet. Little Bo stared in disbelief at the scene before her. The girl who had claimed to want to be her friend was now walking arm in arm with Azella. And worse, the two of them mockingly referred to little Bohe as the pet lady. Even crueler insults echoing in her ears, some even spreading rumors that she had shamelessly seduced the Duke himself. The girl's expression turned frighteningly dark. Ever since being hurt by Azella 3 years ago, her brother had kept her tightly protected, and she'd never had the chance to properly mix with girls her own age. And it was precisely this lapse that had given Azella the opening to spread her lies unchecked all this time. From the sneering remarks of those around her, little Bohi managed to piece together a fragmented version of the lie. Essentially, Azella had cast herself as an innocent victim, accusing little Bo of trying to steal her attendant, while also deliberately smearing her relationship with her brother as improper. Hearing this, the girl clenched her fists in fury, but with dignity she stood her ground and defended herself. Julian came to join our order of Ectonia Immortal Knights of his own free will. But the arrogant Azella, as if she'd been prepared for this all along, brazenly pointed her fan at the isolated girl, sneering that she was nothing more than a dog the Grand Duke kept as a pet, and the crowd around her chimed in with mocking agreement. How absurd. Little Bo stood there helplessly, a chill spreading from the soles of her feet straight to her heart. She hadn't expected that after all these years, Azella would still be this cruel and unreasonable. But without her brother's protection, what was she supposed to do now? The girl fell silent, lowering her head, but Azella showed no sign of holding back. The Grand Duke's probably dead on the battlefield and never coming back. Rather than let a pet like you inherit as head of the family, they might as well let a decent stray dog take over instead. The onlookers burst into loud laughter, and by now the dark aura surrounding little Bowie had visibly thickened, visible even to the naked eye. These people could say whatever they wanted about her, but anyone who slandered her brother, she would never let off the hook. Perched on her throne, the Empress had also noticed this dangerous scene unfolding, the same dark energy she'd once felt herself banished by, and intrigued she watched closely, when suddenly a furious voice rang out in her mind. "Your Majesty, I have something to say to you." A flash of blue light streaked across the room, and before the crowd's stunned, terrified eyes, the Empress had already teleported directly in front of little Bohe. This is the cleverest girl I have ever met. Facing Azella's harassment, little Bo had bravely struck back head-on, summoning the Empress seated on high through sheer force of will, and the noisy hall fell instantly silent. The Empress lazily swirled the wine glass in her hand, asking with amusement what little Bo wanted from her. The once untouchable young ladies had already been scared witless off to the side, huddling together and trembling. And in contrast, little Bo appeared remarkably composed, her voice ringing out firmly in the hushed hall. "It's this group here openly defying the adoption decree you issued." The moment she finished speaking, Azella immediately protested. We... They all knew just how terrifying the Empress's temperament could be, so she figured she might as well pin the entire blame on little Bohe instead. But the shrewd Empress wasn't so easily fooled. She coldly declared that she despised liars more than anything else. And the very next moment, with a simple squeeze of her hand, the wine glass crumpled into worthless scrap. As if worried the young ladies might have already forgotten, the Empress deliberately repeated the phrase, "keeping a pet," a few more times. And this time Azella completely panicked. While the Empress's gaze toward little Bowie carried an added measure of admiration, this clever girl, even after witnessing her terrifying power firsthand, had still dared, at this critical moment, to boldly summon her old enemy. A level of courage that put this entire group of useless young ladies to shame. No wonder the Grand Duke doted on this sister of his so much. "So what do you plan to do next?" The Empress's voice echoed directly in her mind, and little Bo froze for a moment, before calmly issuing her command. None of these people deserved forgiveness. Nothing mattered more to her than her brother, and if joining forces with anyone could protect him, she was willing to do whatever it took. The moment she received the signal, the Empress broke into a bloodthirsty smile, and the ice crystals in her hand condensed into a blade. She could hardly wait. Beyond the pleasure of killing, she could also use this opportunity to have the Grand Duke owe her a favor. The Empress counted them off on her fingers. 5 in total. More than enough for a little disciplinary cleanup, she said with a smile, telling the young ladies not to worry. The noble titles they left vacant would simply be filled by other adopted children. The Empire would always welcome those loyal to her policies. As her words trailed off, the surging tide of magical energy grew stronger and stronger, and Little Bo watched coldly from the side. None of these people deserved her sympathy. The kind-hearted little lady was on the verge of committing murder, all because this group of noble young ladies had insulted her brother right in front of her. Little Bo had never felt such an intense urge to kill before, even if protecting her brother cost her her own life. She was prepared to join forces with the Empress to eliminate these people, who had humiliated him. Azella had already gone pale with terror at the sight before her. She'd only meant to humiliate little Bohe, never imagining that this little noble lady from the slums would actually have the nerve to summon her majesty. Just as the Empress's ice blades were about to fly, the young ladies screeched like a bunch of shrews in the middle of the hall. But just then, Rita's brother suddenly dropped to his knees, pleading on the girl's behalf. And the family members of the other young ladies quickly followed suit, groveling and kowtowing toward little Bo. Azella's father, meanwhile, delivered a resounding slap across his daughter's face, the sharp crack echoing through the entire hall. And forcing her head down, he made her apologize to the young lady. In an instant, shame and humiliation flooded the girl's chest. Yet in Bo's eyes, every one of these people deserved exactly what was coming to them. But the very next moment, Azella's father crawled forward on his knees, tugging pleadingly at the hem of the young lady's skirt. And in that instant, little Bo found herself thinking of her brother. That man, unstoppable on the battlefield, had once compromised with the Emperor for her sake as well. And at this moment, something in the girl's heart began to waver. Seeing this, the Empress voluntarily extinguished the magic in her hand, stretching lazily with a resigned sigh. She had originally intended to hand little Bohi the power of life and death over these people, but it seemed the girl was hesitating, so perhaps it was time to end this farce. Just as everyone breathed a collective sigh of relief, the Empress turned back with a cold glance. "I'll remember all of you." With that, she put on another falsely benevolent smile, and the ball continued on as if nothing had happened. But no one dared to provoke the young noble lady again. Tonight's decisive counterattack was more than enough to prove to everyone that she was no pet lady as Azella had claimed, but the rightful young mistress of the ducal household, and that even with the Grand Duke away, she was fully capable of holding her own. Still, little Bo couldn't help but feel a small pang of regret. Given this atmosphere, there was no way anyone would dare ask her to dance now, and all that grueling practice she'd put in would go to waste. Even with Kamen's comfort, the girl still couldn't fully shake off her low spirits. She thought glumly to herself, why hadn't her brother come back yet? Her brother could no longer tell whether what he felt for his sister was familial love or something more. But he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't bear to disappoint her. He had promised little Bohe that he would dance the very first dance with her at the ball, and so despite the sheer number of monsters at the border, Julius had rushed back at the fastest possible speed. Meanwhile, little Bo was out on the terrace by herself, clearing her mind, the gentle evening breeze stirring the soft, loose strands of her hair, the moonlight pooling like water, making her look like a spirit lost in the night. And this breathtakingly beautiful scene happened to be witnessed by the crown prince passing by. So this was the girl his mother was pressuring him to marry? He had already been utterly won over by the young lady's display of courage earlier, and now he found himself wanting even more to become this clever, beautiful girl's lover. But seeing her lonely figure, she seemed to be troubled by something. So the gentlemanly crown prince decided to wait a while before asking her to dance. In truth, little Bo was thinking of her brother out on the battlefield. Everyone said something had happened to him, and that he wasn't coming back. But she simply refused to believe it. Her brother had never once lied to her. The girl forced herself to wipe away the tears on her cheeks, and just then a familiar voice rang out behind her. Little Bo turned around in delighted surprise, and there, right before her eyes, was the brother she had longed for day and night. Compared to before he'd left for war, the man now carried an added air of maturity, yet his eyes were filled with bloodthirsty menace. "Who made you cry?" Sparks crackled in the man's hand. If his sister named a name, He wouldn't hesitate for a second to snap that person's neck, but before he could even react, his sister had already thrown herself into his arms, tears finally spilling freely. In her brother's arms, little Bowie let out all the pent-up grievances of these past days, terrified that everything before her might just be a dream, that once she woke, her brother would be gone again. After a good long while, the exhausted girl finally let go, looking up at her brother with a shy expression, a large wet patch now soaking his coat. But instead of minding it in the slightest, Julia stepped forward gently and wiped away the tear tracks at the corners of her eyes, filled with regret. He had already guessed that his sister had been crying because she missed him. There was no denying it. The child who had once barely reached his waist had truly grown up. And now little Bowie was like a dazzling jewel, leaving her brother feeling both proud and at the same time wanting to hide her away from the world entirely. His sister had let her bareback show in front of him, and it was only then that her brother realized his little princess had truly grown up. Julius draped his own scarf over little Beau's shoulders, worried she might catch a chill and fall ill. Though of course he had his own private motive as well. He didn't want any other man to catch sight of her lovely figure. The scarf still carried her brother's warmth, and a bittersweet sweetness stirred in little Beau's heart. But she worried her brother might think her gown looked too mature for her, and she carefully lifted her small face to ask, "Does this style still suit me?" Julius nodded immediately. His sister had always been the most beautiful girl he'd ever seen, and this gown made her look even lovelier than any princess out of a fairy tale. Just then, her brother suddenly remembered a promise he hadn't yet fulfilled, and he produced a special gift from within his coat. Gently pinning it to his sister's chest, little Beau stared unblinkingly at the beautiful brooch, a thin mist of tears clouding her eyes. This was her favorite shade of gold. Just like her brother's hair color, this gift must have taken a great deal of thought on his part. But before she could even thank him, the man had already extended his hand toward her like a gentleman. "I heard you still haven't had your first dance." Little Beau felt her eyes stinging. Her brother truly hadn't forgotten their promise after all. When the girl returned to the ballroom, she was once again met with the same malicious whispers as before, all eyes turning toward her. But little Beau no longer felt the fear she had upon first arriving. The warmth radiating from beside her was enough to make her heart race, and she found herself looking forward to twirling and swaying with her brother across the dance floor. As the soft flowing music began to play, her brother's broad hand settled around the girl's slender waist. "Let's begin." But little Beau suddenly stiffened. This melody was one she knew all too well. It was the very piece she'd practiced worst of all. And she remembered all too well how many times she'd trampled poor Rowell's feet trying to master it. This was going to be a disaster. Why did it have to be this particular song? She looked at her brother helplessly. But the man simply returned her gaze with a reassuring look. And since her brother wasn't worried in the slightest, little Bowie decided to let herself relax too. She would trust her brother unconditionally. What she didn't know, however, was that Julius had secretly placed a restraining seal on the very brooch he'd given her, one meant to suppress her magical power. He was the perfect brother in everyone's eyes, attentive and endlessly patient. And once he made a promise to his sister, he always kept it. To make it back in time for little Bowie's opening dance, Julius, stationed far off at the border, had scarcely stopped to rest as he cleared out monster after monster, and it was fortunate he'd made it back in time. Otherwise, he never would have known just what kind of humiliation his little princess had endured. But that was a matter to deal with later. Right now, all he wanted was to be his sister's perfect dance partner. Little Beau had originally been worried she might step on her brother's feet. But after dancing for a while, she realized that Julius had been adjusting his steps to match hers the entire time, his gentle, focused gaze offering the girl silent, powerful encouragement. Occasionally, Julius would send his sister spinning outward with a daring flourish, only to pull her back into an even more intimate embrace with a steady, sure motion. And in that moment, little Beau's entire world was filled with nothing but her brother. As they spun and swayed together across the dance floor, though they were siblings in name, the sight of them together somehow felt untouchable, as if no one else could ever come between them. As the song came to an end, Julius lifted his sister high into the air, and the hall immediately erupted into thunderous applause, everyone marveling at their masterful dancing. But only little Beau herself knew the truth. She had felt just like a puppet on strings. She had even ended up airborne. Without her brother's lead, she was the kind of dancer who could trample a partner's feet to ruin. How had this even happened? Her cheeks flushed with a shy blush, and her small hand instinctively slipped through the crook of her brother's arm. But the moment they returned to the resting area, the Duke's expression suddenly darkened. What had happened? He'd already pieced together the whole story from the whispered gossip. No wonder little Bohé had been crying so hard. This treasure he cherished so dearly had actually been publicly humiliated by Azella in front of everyone. Julius nearly reached the brink of losing control entirely. But not wanting to ruin his sister's debut, the man forced himself to calm down in silence. Meanwhile, little Bohé had received yet another invitation to dance, this time from the Crown Prince. She was deeply reluctant to dance with any man other than her brother, but she remembered her teacher's earlier advice. If a young lady failed to receive at least 2 invitations to dance at a ball, it meant her debut had failed. Not only would she become the laughingstock of the other young ladies, but her entire family would be shamed as well because of it. So little Bo reluctantly accepted Eowyn's invitation, though the Crown Prince's dancing was nowhere near as masterful as the Grand Duke's, meaning he had no choice but to sacrifice his own feet in the process. Still, if it meant winning little Boe's affection, he considered the price well worth paying. His beloved sister being harassed by the Crown Prince sent her sister-obsessed brother into an immediate rage on the spot. He had only meant to step away to cool off for a moment, but the scheming empress had deliberately lured him away, and by the time he returned, he found this thoroughly inappropriate scene unfolding before him, while the oblivious little Bo still had no idea just how suggestive her posture with the Crown Prince appeared. Just a moment ago, Eowyn had invited the girl for the second dance of the evening, and throughout it, little Bohé had stepped on his feet more than a few times. The more nervous she got, the more mistakes she made. When the dance finally ended, having stepped all over the young man's feet, the girl bowed awkwardly in apology. That was my fault. But the Crown Prince simply responded with an easygoing smile, saying it was his own fault for not having the Grand Duke's exceptional dancing skills, then sincerely thanked the young lady. Thank you. Little Bo, too, had come to accept this new friend of hers, and instinctively reached out to take the young man's hand, catching Eowyn off guard for a moment, before he clasped her pale, delicate hand firmly in return. The nighttime courtyard was quiet and romantic, the gentle evening breeze rippling the paired reflections on the lake's surface. And it was only then that little Bo got her first proper look at the young man beside her. His features bore a resemblance to the Empress's, yet his temperament was entirely the opposite of hers. Little Bo was lost in thought when, without her noticing, the Crown Prince had leaned in close beside her. You smell really nice. The young man drew closer and closer, seemingly unable to help himself, his nose hovering just beside her, his crystal-fringed lashes trembling faintly in the moonlight. Little Boa herself was puzzled as to why she might smell nice, but she suddenly recalled an embarrassing incident from a few months back. After eating roasted meat, she'd been swarmed by the estate's dogs, and their behavior back then had looked exactly like Eowyn's did now. And thinking further, she remembered that her lunch recently had been the Greedy Wolf brand steak. The girl recoiled in horror, covering her collar bashfully as she awkwardly explained that the smell on her was just from the meat. The Crown Prince couldn't help but be amused by her adorable reaction. And the young noble lady's image only grew more vivid and endearing in his eyes. Even though this whole arrangement had been his mother's doing, he found that his feelings for her were genuine. But this cheerful, laughing scene between the two of them was witnessed entirely by Julius standing off to the side. He himself wasn't quite sure why he felt so angry, but all he wanted was to hide his sister away as quickly as possible. The man strode over to the two of them with an air of hostility, his face grim as he demanded to know what the Crown Prince thought he was doing. Recognizing the newcomer as the young lady's brother, Eowyn wisely took his leave. But before he left, as if in provocation, he planted a lingering kiss on little Bo's hand, and Julius's furious gaze nearly tore the young man's retreating figure to shreds. They were brother and sister deeply in love with each other, yet the brother could only bury his feelings deep in his heart. But watching the growing number of suitors around his sister, he found himself unable to suppress his jealousy any longer. Julius turned away in silence. He didn't need little Bo's response. Perhaps protecting her in the role of brother was, after all, the best choice, but the sensitive little Bohé noticed something was off. Could her brother be upset? She lifted the hem of her skirt and followed behind the man, only then realizing that her brother had been deliberately walking slowly this whole time, just to wait for her. The girl cautiously spoke up, wanting to know what her brother had experienced at the border, and Julius patiently told her all about it. how they had searched the entire mountain range to find the monster's lair, and how they had wiped them all out before returning home victorious, leaving out all the bloody, brutal details of the fighting. Though little Bo could still guess just how grueling it must have been, she was simply glad it was all finally over. As they chatted along, their conversation eventually turned to the cult of Kala. Little Bo had already heard that this heretical cult's leader was a descendant of the Dragonkin lineage, one that happened to be the natural enemy of the celestial dragon lineage the Empress belonged to. The Dragonkin's descendants were born with the innate ability to control monsters, and it was precisely because of her existence that the cult of Kala had grown so powerful. But 7 years ago, that very cult leader had already died at the edge of the Grand Duke's sword. So could this recent monster uprising mean their leader had somehow come back to life? The girl felt an inexplicable chill run down her spine. She found herself recalling a recurring scene from her nightmares back at the orphanage, a young woman with a face identical to her own floating above a battlefield like a corpse, while a blood-soaked Julius knelt before her. This dream, along with the dark energy that occasionally erupted from within her, had left her quietly unsettled. But before she could press him further, Julius abruptly cut off the topic. The next moment, her brother's warm, large hand wrapped around her cold, small one, and though he didn't turn to look at her, he was silently telling her not to worry. And in that moment, the girl grew even more resolute in her determination to protect her brother. Even if her opponent proved far more difficult to deal with than Azella, she would never admit defeat. But little Bohei had no idea that. Once back at her estate, Azella had grown even more unhinged, furiously ordering her attendants to dig up every unbearable detail of little Bo's past. At the orphanage, determined to destroy her by any means necessary. What would happen if you got caught secretly watching your brother sleep? Early the next morning, little Bohei padded barefoot straight to the Grand Duke's room, and seeing her brother's peaceful, sleeping face, the weight pressing on her heart finally lifted. Her brother really had come back. The girl simply stood there quietly watching, worried that the moment she left, he might vanish again. But before long, little Bo found herself completely absorbed. Even asleep, her brother still looked as radiant as the sun. She still remembered their very first meeting, when Julius had pulled her out of hell like a god descending to earth, giving her the status of a noble young lady. And in all the times of danger since, it had always been her brother risking his own life to save her. The girl's thoughts had already drifted far away, but the man before her slowly opened his eyes, and the instant their gazes met, little Bo's cheeks burned scarlet. She wished she could dig a hole and bury herself right then and there, while Julius was equally caught off guard. His sister had been standing watch by his bedside since the crack of dawn. After questioning her gently, he learned that little Boe had simply been worried he might disappear again. Watching his sister's anxious, insecure expression, the man felt a pang of tenderness, and he affectionately ruffled the top of her head. But before little Bo could even feel touched, her brother abruptly dropped his gentle demeanor, instead telling her that from now on, she wasn't allowed to go wandering around in her nightgown. Julius had long since realized his sister had grown up, her knowledge and courage now more than enough to let her hold her own. But when it came to matters between men and women, she remained as innocent as a blank sheet of paper. It seemed the matter of proper education on such things needed to be addressed without further delay. So that very afternoon, the Grand Duke summoned both Roel and the headmaid to his office, and the three of them deliberated at length, ultimately deciding that Bohei needed a few friends her own age. Matters this private, they agreed, were best explained to her by a close girlfriend. As it happened, the young lady of the Graham family had recently sent over an invitation to a tea party, and the three of them agreed unanimously that this was a good opportunity. When Roel handed the invitation to little Bohei, the girl's eyes couldn't hide her delight. She truly longed to have a few close friends she could share secrets with. But the moment she thought back to her disastrous performance at the debutante ball, little Bo's spirits sank once again. Fortunately, the butler encouraged her in time, and in the end, the girl decided to muster her courage and give it another try. But she had no idea that even without Azella present, her hope of finding close friends still wouldn't go smoothly. He was the gentlest guardian by his sister's side, caring for her daily life, accompanying her through her growth, and if his sister so much as glanced his way, he would even give up marriage entirely for her sake. But little Bohei was in the end no delicate flower meant only for the greenhouse, and eventually Julius agreed to let her attend the Graham family's tea party, though he still reminded his sister not to force herself to endure anything uncomfortable. The Actonia family would always be her steadfast support, no matter what. In the carriage, Little Bo could hardly contain her excitement. Her brother had finally agreed to let her mingle with noble young ladies her own age, and if she made a good impression, she was sure to make a few new friends. And then she could go shopping together with her new girlfriends. But what if she messed it up again? Little Bo grew so anxious she couldn't sit still, and the attentive Julian thoughtfully changed the subject for her. I heard you got into another conflict with Azella recently, over me. Caught off guard by the question, the girl waved it off casually. Protecting her friends was simply part of her duty. But the next moment, Julian solemnly knelt on one knee, telling Bo that if he ever became a burden to her someday, she should abandon him without a moment's hesitation. The young man was well aware of his own lowly status, unworthy of a noble young lady, and so he felt he ought to leave. But to his surprise, little Bowie grew upset upon hearing this. The girl chattered on insistently, urging Julian to abandon such thoughts immediately. To her, Julian wasn't just her best friend. He was family she could entrust her very life to. The girl gripped Julian's hand tightly, and the young man's gaze deepened as well. In the end, he let out a helpless sigh. Then, with deep sincerity, pressed a kiss to the back of the girl's hand. He had given little Bo her chance. From now on, even in death, he would never leave his young mistress's side. Julian's confession successfully eased little Bo's anxiety, and at last, they arrived at the Graham family estate. The girl silently cheered herself on, determined not to make the same mistake as last time. But the moment little Bo pushed open the door, she discovered that all the other young ladies were dressed in matching crimson red, while she alone wore a pale, mismatched yellow, standing out awkwardly from everyone else. And to make matters even more embarrassing, from the very moment she entered the room, a stream of flattering compliments never seemed to stop. Nothing at all like the scene of friendship she had imagined. By now, little Bohei may well have already sensed that something wasn't quite right. Aren't you being a little too sensitive? To settle the score for her brother, little Bo took the initiative and challenged Rita's brother to a duel. She hadn't originally wanted to bother with this unreasonable man, but he simply kept pushing his luck shamelessly, first scratching little Bo's arm, then cursing her and her knight as nothing more than filthy trash from the slums. The Grand Duke adopting her is nothing but an embarrassment to all nobility. Hearing this, little Bo's expression darkened instantly. The brother she loved most, and the best friend she had, both blatantly insulted by this man without a shred of restraint. And no matter how kind-hearted a noble young lady she might be, she couldn't let this slide. She shot him an icy glare, and immediately stepped forward, gripping the man in a vice-like hold. I demand that you duel him. Little Bo knew exactly how capable Julian was. Before, she'd been unwilling to bother with this man purely out of concern for causing her brother trouble. But now that they had come after her directly, showing any more weakness would only bring shame upon her family. The girl anxiously reminded Julian to be careful, but in the same breath, she also declared fiercely that she intended to give the man a lesson he'd never forget for the rest of his life. Upon hearing this, the devoted young knight immediately drew his sword without hesitation, and the man recoiled in fear, but he shamelessly insisted that their duel had no witnesses, and that he simply wouldn't agree to it. What could they possibly do about it? The girl trembled with fury, but faced with such a scoundrel, all she could do was swallow her anger. If one side forced a duel without a witness present, it would simply be ruled as an assault on a noble, and she couldn't let her momentary satisfaction end up harming Julian. But just then, the black-haired girl from the tea party suddenly appeared. Kelsika had always liked little Bo's composed, dignified manner, and she hadn't expected that the moment she stepped outside, she'd run right into the girl being bullied like this. Without hesitation, the girl stepped up boldly, declaring that she herself could serve as the witness, and mockingly taunting the man for being a cowardly, incompetent fool. Isaac, a young viscount no less, had never suffered such an insult before, and in a fit of impulsive rage he accepted Julian's challenge. But the reality was, his skills were far too lacking, and within just a few exchanges, the young man had already knocked him flat on the ground, his pathetic, disheveled state looking every bit like some ridiculous clown. The black-haired girl watched with great amusement, but when she turned her head, she was startled to see that the young noble lady was clutching tightly at her own chest, her pained expression looking as though she were drowning. Little Bo herself had no idea what was happening to her, only that a scene from her childhood beatings had suddenly surfaced in her mind. The abusive director raising his fist, cursing her as a worthless burden, the image bleeding together uncontrollably with the sight of Julian in front of her, and little Bowie felt as though she could barely breathe. Fortunately, Kelsika knew some basic first aid, and she patiently guided the young noble lady through breathing exercises. And after a good while, little Bowie finally managed to steady herself. Looking at Kelsika with gratitude, in her heart, this beautiful, spirited young lady had already become her dear friend. The two of them said their goodbyes with genuine reluctance. And before leaving, Kelsika repeatedly urged little Bohei that if she ever felt unwell again, she should see a doctor as soon as possible. And little Bo obediently nodded along, not realizing at all that this episode of chest pain had, in fact, been the first sign of her magical power beginning to spiral out of control. Right in front of her brother, the young noble lady actually got drunk, leaning weakly against her brother's shoulder, humming some indistinct little tune, her body, freshly bathed, carrying the delicate fragrance of a young woman, and Julius felt his heart skip an unexpected beat. He gazed quietly at his sister beside him. There was no denying it. His little princess had grown even more beautiful. But at the same time, he had to admit, his sister truly had grown up. As a brother, Julius still wanted to keep her shielded behind him like a child, but little Bo protested indignantly. She grabbed her brother's large hand and pouted that she was already an adult. With that, she carefully opened her palm, and the instant their palms touched, little Bo's cheeks flushed even redder. But after just a second's hesitation, the girl withdrew her hand in disappointment. It wasn't that she didn't love her brother. It was just that she'd suddenly realized she wasn't worthy of standing by his side as an equal. Thinking back over these years since her adoption, she, useless as she was, had only ever been a burden to others. Her brother had been hurt and bled for her, had even nearly lost his life. No wonder he still didn't treat her as an adult. But she really had worked so hard to grow up, forcing herself through all that unpleasant socializing, studying tirelessly day and night, all just to make her brother proud. Earlier, while bathing, she'd wondered whether she should even have told her brother about being bullied that day. Little Bo, he truly wished she could still curl up in her brother's arms and pout like she used to as a child, crying to him whenever she felt wronged. But she had already resolved to become a strong adult. She didn't want to be a delicate flower kept safe in a greenhouse. She wanted to become her brother's shield, too. Emboldened by the alcohol, little Bo lifted her misty eyes and, timidly, asked her brother if he could start treating her as an adult. Julius froze at the question, but the next moment, the thoroughly tipsy little Bohei simply slumped over and fell asleep. Watching this, the Grand Duke let out a helpless chuckle, but worried his sister might catch a chill sleeping there. He gently gathered her into his arms at that moment. Bohei looked just like an adorable little kitten, nuzzling affectionately against her brother as she dozed, the fragrance of her bath soap mingling with the sweet scent of alcohol, and Julius's heart raced even faster. He himself wasn't quite sure what kind of feelings he held for this sister who shared no blood with him, but this emotion, in the end, could only remain buried deep within his heart. The man carried his sister back to his own room and sat by her bedside, keeping watch through the entire night. The drunken girl had been carried back to her chambers by her brother, and by the time little Bohei woke again, it was already the next day. She rubbed her sore, puffy eyes, still a little dazed from having just woken up. But the moment she saw her brother sitting by her bedside, the girl's fair little face instantly burst into flames. Little Bowie suddenly remembered everything that had happened the night before. Not only had she clung to her brother, drunkenly begging him to drink with her, she'd also asked him to treat her like an adult. And thinking back on how she'd behaved after drinking, the girl wished she could dig a hole and disappear into it. What's more, she was startled to discover she had been sleeping in her brother's own bed. No wonder he'd had to rest in the chair instead. The mortified little Bohei apologized over and over, and Julius, amused by her adorable reaction, couldn't help but laugh. The ducal estate did, in fact, have plenty of empty rooms. He'd simply stayed by her side out of worry that she might feel unwell, but he added that she really shouldn't drink again next time, especially not when he wasn't around. The mere thought of the girl's unwitting, tipsy allure was enough to make the Grand Duke want to lock her away forever. From that day on, little Bo obediently stopped drinking altogether. While Julius threw himself back into his demanding work, the border remained far from peaceful during this stretch of time, and so the responsibility of educating the young noble lady fell to Roel. One day, as usual, little Bo was planning to go find her brother to share a meal together, when Roel called out to her from behind. The man handed her an elegantly designed invitation, but the girl declined without a second thought. After her previous experiences, She no longer held any hope for these time-wasting tea parties. But Roel told her that this particular letter was an invitation from the Crown Prince himself. Little Bohe couldn't help but feel a little surprised. She'd assumed Eowyn had already forgotten about her entirely. Though she genuinely wanted to become friends with this gentle young man, she couldn't forget that Eowyn's mother was the very same deranged empress who had hurt her brother. Nor could she forget the empress's remarks at the debutante ball about wanting her as a daughter-in-law. Her brother already had enough on his plate. She didn't want her own selfish wants to cause him any more trouble. I'm not going... Roel, too, had no particular wish to see little Bo get entangled with the royal family. But he was far more curious about how his young mistress had become so familiar with the crown prince in the first place. And so the girl recounted in full detail that time they'd spent alone together in the garden, because being caught smelling like meat had been so mortifying. The young noble lady had simply assumed that was the reason Eowyn had taken such notice of her. But the more she talked, the more dangerous Roel's expression toward her seemed to grow. And the next moment, the man suddenly closed the distance between them, his handsome face full of exasperation and urgency, as he firmly gripped little Bo's shoulders to straighten her posture. If I've alarmed you, I apologize. Do you understand what it means when a man tells you that you smell nice? The girl froze at the question, then shook her head in bewilderment. And the butler, looking at his young mistress at once slow on the uptake yet strangely innocent, could only sigh helplessly when a man told a woman, "You smell nice," he was referring to a young woman's natural fragrance. It meant he was hinting that he had feelings for her. Watching little Bo's blank, bewildered expression, Roel suddenly felt he'd overstepped. Though he did feel he genuinely needed to have a talk with the Grand Duke about the young lady's education. Her brother had remained unmarried his entire life for his sister's sake. Yet his little princess had already been receiving so many love letters. It was only now that Julius truly realized his sister had reached the age for courtship and marriage. As the Empire's most distinguished young noble lady, it was only natural that she should have countless suitors trailing after her. Yet for some reason, the thought left his heart aching. Listening to Roel's report, the man forced himself to stay calm. He should act like a proper guardian, carefully screening out the finest possible partner for his sister, then personally handing her over to another man. Julius felt as though his heart were bleeding, but as her brother, all he could do was quietly continue watching over her. And so the Grand Duke agreed to the butler's request to deliver the marriage proposals to little Bo. But the girl, receiving her very first love letters, felt no joy at all. Most of the people wanting to marry her were clearly only after the power of the family behind her. She suddenly understood the wistful look her brother always wore while reading through his own love letters. But since her brother had arranged for these to be sent to her, little Bo obediently sat down to read through them anyway. But no sooner had she opened the very first letter than she discovered it was from Rita's brother. The scoundrel poured out his deep longing for little Bo, in the most saccharine terms, his sleazy character practically radiating off the page. And little Bo shuddered with disgust. Wasn't this just a little too much? And unfortunately, the confession letters that followed weren't much better. By the time little Bo finished going through them all, several hours had already passed, and the exhausted girl was preparing to retire for the night, when she suddenly remembered Kelsika, who had helped her a few days earlier. Little Bohe had grown genuinely fond of this newly made friend, and perhaps in the coming days she should prepare a gift to visit Kelsika's home and properly thank her. She vaguely remembered the young lady wearing an old, well-worn dagger at her waist, and so little Bo decided to go ask Julian about it. Given how long he'd served as a knight, he surely knew a thing or two about weapons. But when she knocked on Julian's door, there was no response for a long while, and from inside the room came the faint sound of a man's suppressed groans. Worried, little Bo pushed the door open and found Julian collapsed painfully on the floor, his muscles taut as though he were enduring immense agony. She hurried over and helped him up. The man's body was cold as ice, and the girl's heart clenched painfully in response. Little Bo took a deep breath. Right now, she was the only one who could save Julian, and so the girl strained to hoist him onto her shoulder, inching her way step by step toward the bed. But how could someone so slight and fragile possibly support the weight of a tall, powerfully built man? She hadn't gone more than a few steps when a searing pain shot through her ankle, and with her balance thrown off, the two of them collapsed together onto the bed, the injured, devoted young man landing heavily on top of the girl, his handsome face suddenly inches from hers. Little Bo's cheeks burned instantly. But this was no time to feel bashful. Julian's body was terribly heavy, and try as she might to call him back to consciousness, the young man remained unresponsive. With no other choice, little Bowie struggled to crawl out from under him, but before she could even catch her breath, Julian on the bed let out a pained groan, and little Beau's heart leapt into her throat once more. She prepared to go find Mr. Roll for help. That man was the Empire's most powerful mage. Surely he would know what to do. But the very next moment, the girl found herself pulled into a broad embrace. The young man's voice helpless and fragile. He trembled as he begged little Beau not to leave. And when the girl turned back, she saw tears glistening in Julian's eyes. In her memory, the young man had always been a pillar of strength. She never once imagined he could cry, and that it was out of worry for her that he now shed tears. Julian seemed to have exhausted the very last of his strength. He collapsed heavily back onto the bed, sinking once more into unconsciousness. His ice-cold body now even weaker than before, and little Beau grew so anxious she nearly burst into tears. But just then, she suddenly sensed an unsettling force radiating nearby, its eerie presence even more menacing than the one she'd felt from the Empress. And this power, she realized, was hidden inside Julian's drawer. Guided by pure instinct, little Beau found a jet-black feather tucked away inside. She had no idea what its purpose might be, but some instinct told her this was something deeply malevolent. And so she went to fetch Roll. As a burst of light flared up, the man immediately determined that this was an extremely vicious curse, one that could very well kill Julian if left unchecked. But the medium carrying it had been dusted heavily with spirit stone powder specifically meant to prevent tracing, and with his current abilities, there was no way to identify who had cast the curse. Still, one thing was certain. Whoever had done this had to be an extraordinarily wealthy noble. After all, spirit stones were exceedingly rare, and using this much of the powder was well beyond the means of an ordinary aristocrat. Little Beau carefully racked her brain, trying to think of anyone who might hold a grudge against Julian. And the first person who came to mind was Azella. That woman had already offended the Empress at the debutante ball, and had also been rejected after pursuing Julian's affections. There was no telling what extreme measures she might resort to. There was also another possibility, Rita's brother, who had been humiliated by Julian last time in the duel, someone who should have hated her by rights, yet had brazenly proposed marriage to her instead. Perhaps he too had already been harboring resentment all along. Their most urgent task now was to find the source of the curse as quickly as possible, and save Julian's life. And so little Beau had no choice but to face that repulsive scoundrel one more time. Wanting to protect both her brother and her childhood friend, she chose to put herself in harm's way, and very nearly lost her life to that vile man in the process. Just a little while earlier, little Beau had discovered a cursed feather hidden in Julian's room, and after analyzing it together with Roll, they had narrowed their suspect down to Rita's brother. And as it happened, this very man had recently sent her a love letter. So she decided to play along with his scheme, bringing Roll with her to visit the young Viscount's estate. The moment they walked through the door, Isaac rushed eagerly to greet her, showering her with an endless stream of flattering, romantic words. And little Beau felt her stomach turn. But for the sake of uncovering the truth, all she could do was grit her teeth and maintain a strained, forced smile. But the man only grew more and more excited as he spoke, step by step closing the distance toward the girl. And little Bowie suddenly felt an inexplicable wave of unease wash over her. The next instant, Isaac pulled a sharp dagger from beneath his coat and lunged straight at the girl's chest. Little Beau's eyes widened in horror. She wasn't afraid to die, but Julian was still waiting for her back at the estate. And so was her brother. If her brother learned she had died, he would surely be devastated. But the pain she'd braced for never came. The girl cautiously opened her eyes, only to find the man frozen rigidly in place. While Roll stood behind her, his face contorted with fury, and as several flashes of white light streaked past, thick black smoke began billowing from Isaac's body. It was only then that little Bowie understood. The young Viscount's strange behavior these past few days had also been the result of a curse. So who exactly was trying to harm her? A chill of belated fear crept into the girl's heart. She worried that these people's ultimate goal was to use her as a means to harm her brother. She had already come far too close to losing him once before, and she couldn't bear to go through that despair a second time. Unfortunately for now, every lead was still under investigation. And little Beau hung her head in frustration. Once again, she had failed. Not only was she unable to save Julian, she'd even walked straight into an enemy's trap. The girl pleaded with the butler to think of some other way, but curses fell under the domain of dark magic. And even as a mage, Roll found himself utterly powerless against it, though he did know of one man who was well versed in the black arts. Little Bohi immediately perked up again. If it meant saving Julian, she was willing to do absolutely anything. But she never expected that this master of dark magic would turn out to be none other than the Crown Prince himself. Worse still, though Eowyn agreed to help lift Julian's curse, he demanded a steep price in return. That little beau willingly agreed to marry him. A girl who loved only her brother had, against her will, agreed to marry someone else. Because if she didn't, not only would Julian die, but the Grand Duke himself would also be plunged into danger. And compared to her own small, insignificant happiness, she cared far more about the safety of the people she loved. And so little Beau went alone to the Crown Prince's chambers, moonlight spilling over the young man's figure like a clear spring. But the girl had no time to admire his handsome features. The Eowyn before her now seemed almost like an entirely different person from the one she'd met before. At the debutante ball, he'd been gentle and considerate, like a prince charming straight out of a fairy tale. But now he looked more like a thorn-covered rose, his stunning beauty carrying an undercurrent of danger at every turn. Little Beau swallowed nervously. Before coming, she had already heard that Eowyn's mastery of magic had long since surpassed even his mother's. And right now, throughout the entire empire, he was the only one capable of lifting Julian's curse. Yet little Beau had only just refused his invitation a few days earlier. "I'm not going." And now here she was, showing up in the dead of night to beg for his help instead. An act that would undoubtedly be seen as terribly rude. But she had no choice but to gamble everything on this. And so the girl anxiously rose to her feet and asked the young man if he could help her lift a curse. She had assumed that for the sake of their friendship, Eowyn would agree to help her. But to her surprise, the man simply smiled and refused. Little Beau froze awkwardly in place. And what Eowyn said next left her even more mortified. "Someone like you, who has everything at your feet, why would you ever need to lower yourself to come begging me? The cold-hearted Grand Duke treasures you as his most precious jewel. The proud mage obeys your every word. And you never seem to lack for outstanding suitors either. Why would you ever need someone like me, a fallen prince who could be killed at any moment?" Hearing this, little Beau couldn't help but feel taken aback. She had always assumed Eowyn was the Empress's most beloved son, never imagining that even the Crown Prince carried his own hidden burdens. The girl could already detect the resentment in the young man's voice. But for Julian's sake, she had no choice but to steel herself and start negotiating terms with Eowyn. Forcing herself to stay calm, little Bohi listed out all the benefits he stood to gain by helping her. Not only would she personally owe the royal family a debt of gratitude, but the Ectonia family, too, would remember the Crown Prince's kindness. Little Beau silently prayed to herself, and to her relief, the young man finally agreed to her request, the weight on the girl's chest finally lifting. But the very next moment, Eowyn suddenly drew close to her in an intimate pose. Gazing deeply at the girl in his arms, "I can save Julian, but the price is little Bohe has to date me." Her brother had suffered a serious injury, yet his sister had agreed to marry someone else. By the time little Beau returned to the ducal estate, it was already deep into the night. Her face etched with exhaustion. To save Julian, she'd had no choice but to agree to the Crown Prince's proposal, and she hadn't yet found the chance to tell her brother any of it. If the Grand Duke found out, surely he would be furious. Just as little Bohi was agonizing over how to break the news to her brother, the butler, who had been waiting anxiously by the door, hurried over to greet her. He had originally wanted to accompany his young mistress to the negotiation, but little Bohe had worried that bringing him along might provoke Eowyn's displeasure, and desperate to save her friend, the girl had disregarded her own safety entirely. Knowing there was no talking her out of it, Roll had no choice but to wait anxiously in the courtyard. And fortunately, the girl returned safely, bringing good news along with her. The Crown Prince had agreed to treat Julian. Hearing little Beau's words, Roll let out a sigh of relief, though a nagging unease still lingered in his heart. Given the Crown Prince's usual temperament, he wouldn't typically concern himself with anyone else's life or death. But seeing the girl's cheerful, playful manner, he told himself he was probably just overthinking things. Once Roll had left, little Beau finally dropped every last bit of her carefully maintained composure, forcing herself to summon her resolve once more. She still needed to explain the matter of her secret engagement to her brother. She dreaded seeing that look of disappointment on his face. But a matter this significant would ultimately have to be confessed. Having steeled herself mentally, Little Bo finally gathered the courage to stand at the door of the master bedroom. At this hour, her brother should still be handling official business, and the girl quietly pushed open the door, only to find her brother covered head to toe in blood. Little Bo was terrified. Yet the injured Julius appeared remarkably composed, forcing himself to sit upright despite the pain. And even in that state, he still remembered to gently reassure his sister. Watching this, Little Bo's composure shattered completely. First Julian, now her brother? Was it that everyone close to her ended up cursed with misfortune? The girl, in a fit of self-loathing, rose to go find Roll for help, but Julius immediately caught her by the arm, telling her helplessly that his injury shouldn't be made public just yet. But to his surprise, Little Bo abruptly cut him off. The girl's voice trembled with suppressed emotion as she loudly demanded to know if he had any idea how severe his injuries were. So it turned out even this rabbit-gentle sister of his had it in her to get angry. Was Bo actually worried about him? Julius chuckled softly, telling her he was fine. But no sooner had he spoken than a holy radiance enveloped his entire body, and his mangled, blood-soaked wounds began healing at a visibly rapid pace. Her brother's body was a mangled mess. Yet to keep his sister from worrying, he had forced himself to heal his own wounds using spirit power, even though doing so came at the cost of burning away his own life force. But Julius simply refused to let his sister feel sad. Gritting through the pain, he forced a stiff smile, never realizing that this only made Little Bo's heart ache even more. She had long known just how powerful this man was. But so what? Her brother was still human too. He cried when he was sad. He felt pain when he was hurt. He had lost so much blood earlier. How could he possibly not be suffering? And now here he was, trying to find some excuse to send her away. But she wasn't going to fall for it this time. The girl stubbornly insisted on disinfecting her brother's wounds herself. And seeing his sister's determined, pouting expression, Julius had no choice but to give in. Even though the wound on his arm had already vanished entirely, his sister still stubbornly went ahead and applied antiseptic and medicine anyway, her movements gentle and soft, slowly unraveling the strings of his heart one by one. But what Little Bowie said next threw a bucket of cold water straight over him. She told her brother that she had already agreed to marry the crown prince. Julius thought he must have misheard. But the next moment, as he lifted his head, he found himself meeting his sister's bashful gaze. Little Bo honestly recounted everything that had happened these past few days. From discovering Julian unconscious, to the crown prince agreeing to lift his curse. These days spent with Eowyn, she said, had helped her understand her own heart. She had fallen hopelessly, irrevocably in love with him. Listening to the girl's romantic confession, Julius could only let out a bitter laugh. He realized he had no standing at all to stand in the way of his sister's romance. And besides, a young noble lady deserved to have a life of her own to lead. The man's heart felt as though it were bleeding, yet he pretended everything was fine, and telling Little Bo not to worry about his feelings. No matter what she chose, her brother would always remain her steadfast support. But what he didn't know was that his sister had also deceived him. Little Bo had never actually fallen for anyone else. The only person she had ever loved, all along, had been her brother. But she also knew that given Julius's temperament, he would never agree to let her strike this kind of bargain with the crown prince, and so she had fabricated this clumsy lie. What she and Eowyn had actually agreed upon was to pose as a couple. For just 3 months, if she could simply endure this stretch of time, Julian would recover fully, and her brother wouldn't need to worry either. Little Bo comforted herself with this thought, unaware that an even greater danger still lay ahead, waiting for her. The moment he laid eyes on his sister, the gentle, devoted golden retriever of a younger brother instantly transformed into a scheming, love-obsessed young man. But once Little Bo learned of his childhood, all she felt left for him was sympathy. It turned out Eowyn had once had 2 older brothers who doted on him dearly, but both of them had been secretly executed for defying the Empress's commands. Hearing this, Little Bo looked up in disbelief. Hadn't the woman the Empress killed been their own biological mother? The crown prince nodded bitterly. To the emperor. Her own children were nothing more than political tools mass-produced for her purposes. And tools weren't allowed to have minds of their own. So the moment anyone defied her commands, they were ruthlessly killed. And now, it seemed, his mother had already set her sights on him as well. Eowyn no longer wanted to keep living this way. So constantly on edge, and so for the time being, an alliance with Little Bo was his best possible option. He told the girl, that the emperor had never been willing to give up the tempting prize that was the Ectonia family. And if the two of them could pose as a couple, his mother wouldn't dare make a move against him during this period. Just 3 months. And by then he would have secured the leverage he needed to survive. Watching the young man's forlorn expression, little Bo couldn't help but think back to her own miserable experiences at the orphanage. Back then, she too had felt just as helpless as Eowyn did now. That constant, gnawing fear that death could come for her at any moment had haunted her like a nightmare. And if it hadn't been for her brother's saving grace, she might well have lost her mind entirely by now. With that thought, she decided to help the Crown Prince. Even setting aside Julian's curse altogether, she would have unconditionally lent a hand to any friend she considered her own. Finally, Eowyn reminded little Bowie that she absolutely must keep this a secret from everyone. Even from the Grand Duke she was closest to, no one could know. Coincidentally, the girl too was worried her brother might worry over this. And so the two of them struck an agreement at once, beginning their charade as a couple. In the days that followed, Eowyn kept his word and successfully cured Julian of his serious illness, and little Bo Hay, in turn, agreed to accompany the young man to all manner of social banquets. On this particular day, it was the princess's birthday celebration, and the Crown Prince had arrived early, waiting at the entrance of the hall. Even though he had already seen little Bo countless times before, he still found himself thoroughly dazzled by the sight of her tonight. Her shimmering gown looked as though it had been studded with starlight, and even more captivating than the starlight itself were the girl's clear, luminous eyes. The young man was momentarily transfixed, but he quickly composed himself, gallantly extending his hand toward the girl, and patiently reminding her to speak as little as possible, to simply play the part of a smiling doll, and leave everything else to him. Her heart belonged only to her brother, yet she had no choice but to agree to the Crown Prince's proposal. Little Bo affectionately looped her arm through Eowyn's, and her diamond-studded gown made her look all the more radiant and striking, instantly drawing every eye in the hall. Julius among them. He watched this seemingly perfect, well-matched couple with a bitter ache in his chest, his mind flooded entirely with his sister's words, "I like Prince Eowyn." His sister had found someone she loved, and as her brother, he should be happy for her. Yet Julius felt as though a piece of his heart had been carved out, and unable to bear watching his sister and the Crown Prince laughing so easily together, he retreated, almost fleeing, into a corner of the hall. Little Bo, for her part, remained completely oblivious to all of this, doing her best to play the part of the dutiful fiancé. Just 3 months. Once these 3 months were over, this absurd arrangement would come to an end, and she and Eowyn would have no need to see each other again anytime soon. But her most pressing concern right now was how to fool the ever-suspicious Empress. Little Bo tried her best to appear composed, gracefully offering the Emperor a bow. And as she rose, she naturally reached for Eowyn's hand, only to be startled to feel the young man's palm trembling, and all little Bo could do was squeeze his hand back reassuringly. Faced with the Empress's ever-shifting moods, neither of them dared to lift their heads, as though awaiting a verdict. But fortunately, the Empress didn't make things difficult for them, and the woman's hearty laughter rang out from her throne, praising the Crown Prince and the young noble lady as a match made in heaven. But before little Bo could even breathe a sigh of relief, the Crown Prince's warm breath brushed against her lips, and they were nearly close enough to kiss. And the girl, not daring to resist, could only let Eowyn have his way, her face burning as if on fire. But just before their lips could touch, the young man suddenly stopped himself, smiling as he reported to his mother on the state of his romance with the young noble lady, his warm, considerate questions making them look every bit like a perfectly ordinary mother and son. Yet as an outside observer, little Bo couldn't help but feel that things weren't quite so simple. Having finally finished their audience with the Emperor, the two of them, having survived the ordeal, fled to the garden outside the hall, and after taking a deep breath of fresh air, the Crown Prince finally allowed himself to relax completely. He told little Bohi that for at least a month no one would be sending assassins after him again. The young man spoke of it so lightly, yet little Bo could sense the bitterness hidden behind his words. Though she too lacked the power to stand against the Empress, all she could do was gently tell Eowyn to hang in there. Even though she and the Crown Prince had little in common, she simply hoped this young man could go on living safely and happily forever. The devoted golden retriever couldn't help himself and pressed a kiss to the girl's cheek, his breath hot against her skin, and little Bo flinched almost imperceptibly, her adorable reaction looking exactly like a startled little rabbit, and Eowyn found himself falling even more helplessly for this endearing girl. He asked little Bo if she'd like to place a bet on whether he'd live or die. Plenty of nobles, he said, were already betting he wouldn't survive. Watching the crown prince's self-deprecating, bitter smile, the girl didn't quite know how to comfort him, but the next moment, the young man's warm breath brushed against her ear once more. Just bet that I won't die. Little Bo couldn't see Eowyn's expression, but she could faintly sense his despair in his voice. Still, the young noble lady refused to take part in the wager, because she believed that this gentle, powerful crown prince would surely find a way through whatever danger came his way. Meanwhile, off in a corner, Julius was drowning his sorrows in wine, unable to let go of his feelings for his sister, and what worried him even more was that his sister still carried a secret that could never, under any circumstances, be exposed. Just then, Princess Arabella walked over toward him, the young woman exchanging polite pleasantries with the Grand Duke. Yet Julius responded only with perfunctory murmurs. Considering they had once been lovers who'd entrusted their very lives to each other, the Grand Duke now seemed colder toward her than even a stranger would be. Yet even so, the young woman showed no sign of taking offense. She asked him directly what little Bohé truly meant to him. Was she simply the precious little sister he had raised since childhood? Or was she the very person he had once searched the entire continent to find? Having his long-guarded secret casually exposed left, Julius's pupils trembling uncontrollably. Could his sister's identity as a descendant of the dragonkin have been discovered? But judging from the princess's tone, it seemed to be nothing more than a guess for now. The man forced himself to stay calm. He knew the princess would never reveal this secret to the empress, but he couldn't be as certain about the crown prince's position. If he allowed the two of them to keep seeing each other, it was only a matter of time before his sister's identity was exposed. His sister had already had several episodes of her magic spiraling out of control before, and so Julius decided it was time to temporarily seal away the young noble lady's power. Just then, a gentle voice called out, interrupting the man's train of thought. He looked up to see his sister approaching with a bright smile, and trailing right behind her was the ever-irritating crown prince. Julius's expression instantly darkened, and he told his sister to get ready. They were heading home right away. Little Bo, completely oblivious to the strange tension between her brother and the crown prince, went off on her own to fetch the carriage. But before the young noble lady had even gone far, the outwardly harmless Eowyn suddenly switched to a provocative smirk. Julius had remained single his entire life for the sake of his beloved sister. Yet the girl had secretly gotten engaged to the son of his sworn enemy. Julius eyed the crown prince warily. This was the very man who, hiding behind his pure and innocent facade, had stolen little Bo's heart. And the mere thought that his sister would one day become someone else's bride sent a relentless ache through the man's chest. But what concerned him even more was how the crown prince actually treated little Bo. His sister was innocent and easily deceived, but he, hardened by countless battles, was not. He knew all too well how Eowyn had managed to be the sole survivor among a whole generation of princes, someone who could grow up in that kind of environment, while still maintaining such an innocent, harmless appearance. His hidden methods were likely far more terrifying than Julius had first imagined. Sure enough, the moment little Bohé left, Eowyn dropped his earlier act entirely, curling his lips into a taunting smile. Shouldn't I have kissed your sister on the neck instead just now? That would have annoyed you even more, wouldn't it? His flippant tone, laced with mockery aimed at little Bo, hadn't even fully registered before Julius was already trembling with fury. This precious treasure he cherished in the palm of his hand, being humiliated like this by an outsider. The man felt a rage unlike any he had ever experienced before, and with a resounding crash, the crown prince's body was slammed brutally against the wall. Julius's strength was so overwhelming it nearly crushed the young man's collarbone entirely, and he glared at the crown prince with vicious intent. I hope you know how to restrain yourself. Don't think I don't know that you're using her. With that, the man released his grip on the young man. He had no idea about the arrangement his sister and Eowyn had made to pretend to be a couple, only that every time he remembered the girl's sweet smile whenever she mentioned Eowyn's name, he couldn't bring himself to stand in the way of his sister's romance. Julius turned and walked away dejected, but Eowyn, unwilling to back down, lifted his head defiantly. What right do you have to interfere with Bo's choices? After all, you're nothing more than her benefactor. No sooner had the young man finished speaking than little Bowie came storming over, furious. That's enough. The girl affectionately looped her arm through her brother's. And the moment she turned back to look at Eowyn, her gaze had turned utterly cold. She could tolerate insults directed at herself, but she could not tolerate her brother being treated with such disrespect. Little Bo warned the Crown Prince that she had no intention of breaking their agreement, but if Eowyn ever dared to be disrespectful toward the Grand Duke again, she would treat their arrangement as though it had never happened. With that, the girl turned and walked away without a backward glance. She had assumed the Crown Prince would come to resent her over this, but to her surprise, her anger only stirred up the young man's possessive desire even more. Her brother and the Crown Prince, it seemed, would eventually have to be chosen between, and little Bo found herself hesitating. Just a little while ago, she and her brother had boarded the carriage home, the moonlight outside the window achingly beautiful, yet neither of them had the heart to admire it. Little Bo's mind was consumed with worry. Her brother seemed to be in an unusually bad mood today, but she had no idea how to comfort him. She had already promised Eowyn she wouldn't reveal the truth of their contracted romance to anyone, but just then a gentle voice interrupted the girl's thoughts. And looking up, little Bo saw Julius wearing a wistful, melancholy expression, the cool moonlight only accentuating his forlorn air, and the girl's heart tightened as she heard her brother's question ring in her ears. "If I asked you to give up your relationship with the Crown Prince, would you agree?" The girl froze at the question, torn between the brother who loved and doted on her, and Eowyn, who could be killed at any moment. And just as little Bohe was struggling to figure out how to answer, the carriage suddenly lurched violently. A servant came to inform them that a wheel had broken, and it would take about 10 more minutes to fix. Little Bo couldn't help but feel relieved. Yet deep down, she already knew her own answer. While they waited, the girl suggested they take a walk through the nearby woods together, and so the two of them made their way deeper into the forest, one following the other, scattered fireflies quietly flickering to life in the darkness, and the two of them felt as though they had fallen into a dazzling sea of stars. Suddenly, little Bo noticed her brother had stopped walking behind her, and turning around in confusion, she noticed a necklace now in the man's hand, a diamond-studded pendant glittering with dazzling light, and she saw her brother smiling as he held it out to her. Little Bo's cheeks instantly flushed. She hadn't even answered her brother's question yet. So why was she receiving a gift first? The girl carefully cradled the necklace in her palms, and the sour mood from earlier melted away entirely because of this sudden, unexpected surprise. She pressed the gift tightly against her chest, then broke into a radiant smile. Just as the two of them were about to head back, an eerie voice suddenly echoed through the forest, the sound like the dying, ghostly caw of a crow. Little Bo flinched in fright, and Julius, hearing it too, furrowed his brow. He told little Bo to wait right where she was, then drew his sword and advanced alone toward the source of the sound. The girl had no idea that the necklace her brother had just given her had sealed away her magical power, and that this eerie voice would mark the beginning of her true identity finally being exposed. His sister had, in truth, died long ago, yet her brother had kept this secret hidden from her all this time. In the war to wipe out the cult years ago, it was Julius himself who had driven a blade straight through little Bohe's heart, and it was he who had watched helpless as the child stopped breathing in his arms. So he had known all along the secret of his sister's resurrection, and that she had once been the sacrificial vessel the cult of Kala used to control the monsters. But little Bo herself remained completely unaware of any of this. The trauma of war, combined with relentless abuse, had stripped away most of her memories, and so Julius had gone along with the ruse, choosing to adopt little Bo as his sister, and protect this ill-fated child in the gentlest way he knew how. Unfortunately, in the forest they encountered a disciple of the cult of Kala, and all of Julius's efforts up to that point were about to be undone in a single day. He had originally told his sister to wait where she was, while he went alone to investigate the depths of the forest. But little Bo, worried about her brother, ended up following his footsteps as well. And before long, the two of them discovered the source of the cries for help, a hooded old woman, her deeply wrinkled face carrying a faintly sinister quality. Little Bo quickly tried to decline, but the woman gave her no chance to leave. And before she knew it, an eerie crystal ball had appeared in the old woman's palm, a sinister purple glow suddenly flaring to life. Little Bo's eyes went wide with shock, while the old woman's face twisted into a manic, gleeful grin. She declared with utter conviction that little Bohe was someone who should have died long ago, that she carried an enormous secret on her shoulders, and that to conceal this secret, she had deceived herself and deceived everyone else along with her. The old woman then turned her gaze toward Julius. This noble lord, too, and is someone who should have died long ago, yet defies the natural order? By continuing to live, sooner or later, death will come knocking for him as well. The old woman's prophecy made little Bohi's pupils constrict with alarm, and she angrily shouted at the woman to shut her mouth. But the old crone only grew even more frenzied, cackling as she declared, "At most 3 years. Because you were never meant to exist in the first place. Within a year, he will surely die." The man's face turned ashen upon hearing this, and in fury he drew his sword, pressing it directly against the woman's throat. This had to be one of the stragglers left over from the campaign to wipe out the cult of Kayla all those years ago. He should have anticipated this. But more than dealing with this villain, he was far more concerned about whether little Bohé would let this get into her head and start spiraling. His resurrected sister had lost her memories, and so her brother had kept hidden from her the truth, that she had once been a sacrifice offered to the cult. He had brought the girl back to the ducal estate and kept her carefully concealed, believing this was the only way to protect his sister. But what Julius didn't know was that little Bo hadn't actually lost all of her memories. She still remembered exactly how she had been taken away, and how she had been chosen as the vessel for the dragonkin, even though only fragmented pieces of memory remained after her resurrection. As she grew older, she had already come to suspect her true identity on her own. But little Bo was greedy. She wasn't willing to give up the happiness that now lay so close within reach. And so the girl chose to deceive herself over and over, convincing herself she was nothing more than an innocent, sheltered young noble lady. Only this way could she remain by her brother's side. But paper can never truly conceal fire, and now her secret had been exposed. The girl looked at her brother in terror, only to see that Julius had already drawn his sword, pointing it at the cult of Kayla's prophet. "You vile creature!" Clearly her brother believed her, and little Bose let out a sigh of relief. The old woman, too, sensed that her own death was imminent, and with the last of her strength, she cursed Julius to die alone and in misery. And the very next moment, her face crumbled like parched, cracked earth, and with 2 sharp, cracking sounds, the woman's body shattered instantly into fragments. Julius turned back to find his sister's expression still shaken with fear, and he hurried to comfort her, explaining that this woman had likely been a surviving prophet from the remnants of the cult of Kayla. A rare few among them possessed the ability to glimpse into both the past and the future. Hearing this, little Bo's heart clenched. Her brother must have already guessed the truth of her lie. So would he kill her the same way he had killed the other heretics before? The thought sent a wave of trembling through the girl's entire body, but Julius told her not to take that mad woman's words to heart. In that moment, little Bo felt the full weight of her brother's unconditional trust. Tears welled up and spilled over, and without a second thought, she threw herself into her brother's arms. Perhaps one day her secret would come out into the open, but she also believed with the same certainty that the future would only get brighter from here. But she never imagined that the cult of Kayla, which had supposedly been wiped out years ago, would rise again right on the outskirts of the capital, and the once peaceful imperial city was transformed overnight into a living hell overrun by monsters. The court scribe cautiously reported on the mounting casualties across the city over the past several days, and the Empress's face, usually plastered with a carefree, mocking smile, had turned grave. As she analyzed the current crisis, and in the end, she arrived at a terrifying conclusion. The Dragonkin's descendant had returned. The girl possessed a terrifying power capable of destroying everything, yet she didn't dare tell her brother about it, because she had once served as the leader of the cult of Kayla's sacrifices, and it was this very cult that had murdered her brother's family. Little Bohi didn't dare take that gamble, even though back then she had been nothing more than a puppet under someone else's control. She still feared that her brother would show her no mercy and kill her without hesitation, so she might as well keep pretending to have lost her memory. This way no one would ever learn of her shameful past. And even if everyone only loved this false version of little Bohé, as long as it meant she never had to let go of her brother's hand, she was willing to keep up the performance for the rest of her life. But she had no idea that her true identity had already been uncovered by the Emperor, and at this very moment the Empress was secretly plotting how best to bring down Julius. What she truly wanted had never been to eliminate the cult. In fact, the monsters overrunning the capital had been released by her own hand, and the Empress's real objective was to force little Bo to reveal her true identity. She had long since noticed that the relationship between the Grand Duke and the young noble lady wasn't the ordinary kind. They didn't seem like a typical sponsor and adopted child at all, but rather like two family members deeply attached to one another. One could even say that little Bohei was Julius's one and only weakness. And as long as she could hold the young noble lady's life as a leverage, she had no fear that the Ectonia family would refuse to hand over their minds, and that in the end was her true goal all along, seizing control of the Spirit Stone mines. And now the opportunity was almost at hand. In just a few days, it would be the Crown Prince's coming-of-age sacred ceremony. And as his betrothed, little Bowie would inevitably have to attend. They would need to cross a canyon teeming with monsters to reach the holy grounds, a journey fraught with danger every step of the way. And all she needed to do was tamper with things just enough to have the young noble lady surrounded by monsters. She had already tested this before. Whenever danger drew near, the dark power dormant within little Beau's body would surge to the surface. And this time there would be no one there to save her. So she found herself rather looking forward to seeing how the girl would perform. A manic smile spread across the Empress's face, as if everything were already firmly within her grasp. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince had just finished a brutal battle, the room now thick with the heavy stench of blood, and his feet surrounded by piles of grotesque corpses. As the last assassin fell dead, the young man collapsed backward onto the bed as though all his strength had left him, a searing pain shooting through his shoulder. Yet deep down, he felt an odd sense of relief. This time his mother had shown some restraint, or perhaps she had simply meant to give him a warning. Aloin stared weakly up at the ceiling, his mind drifting inevitably back to the last time he'd seen little Beau. Back then, he had only meant to provoke the Grand Duke as a bit of a joke. Yet he never expected that rabbit-gentle girl to actually get angry at him. In that moment, jealousy had grown wild and untamed within his heart. He truly had fallen for the innocent, adorable little Bohei. But unfortunately, the person she had feelings for had never been him. Still, none of that mattered anymore now. Someone like him was simply never meant to be loved by anyone. All the Crown Prince wished for was to somehow stubbornly cling to life, though he never imagined that his mother had never once intended to let him go. A girl who loved only her brother had no choice but to pretend to be the Crown Prince's lover, and she couldn't even tell her brother the truth of it. Fortunately, this 3-month charade of a romance was finally coming to an end. As long as the Crown Prince's coming-of-age ceremony went smoothly, she would be able to draw a clean line between herself and Aloin, and there would be no need for the two of them to see each other again for a long while. She had, in fact, felt some sympathy for this beautiful, clingy golden retriever of a young man before. But ever since Aloin had provoked Julius, little Beau had come to realize that all the innocence and gentleness the young man displayed had merely been an act. The real Crown Prince was scheming and deeply cunning, and his motives for approaching her had never been pure to begin with. The girl had spent several days stewing over it, but before her anger could even fully fade, the Crown Prince came to fetch her for the coming-of-age ceremony. And so, on the way to the holy grounds, little Beau finally stopped playing along, seating herself as far from Aloin as possible, her lovely face clearly displeased. And no matter how much the young man called out to her, the girl simply ignored him with disinterest. But in Aloin's eyes, little Beau's behavior looked exactly like a girl pouting for attention. He gently reminded her that it was fine for now since they were in the carriage. But once they stood before the Grand Priest and the Emperor, she would need to play the part of a devoted couple even more convincingly. With that, he gave the young noble lady a playful wink, his impeccably polite manner leaving her with nothing to criticize. And after being handled this way, little Beau's anger had all but completely dissolved. Still, she sternly told Aloin that once today was over, their agreed-upon time would be up, and she wanted nothing more to do with the royal family after this. The young man nodded, looking dejected. Just as little Beau was about to say something more, the carriage suddenly came to a halt. They had, it turned out, already arrived at the entrance to the holy grounds, a bottomless canyon splitting the sprawling mountain range in two, and to proceed any further, they would need to cross a decrepit rope suspension bridge. Little Beau had never regretted anything so much in her life. But there was no turning back now. She steeled herself and took a few steps forward, only to find herself trembling uncontrollably, the wooden planks beneath her feet creaking ominously, and the howling wind battering her from every direction. She barely managed to steady herself by clutching the chains. By comparison, Aloin seemed considerably more composed, telling the young noble lady that these ropes had all been enchanted by his mother, and that even the Empress herself would need to come here in person to damage this bridge. But no sooner had he finished speaking Then a strange figure appeared out of thin air at the head of the bridge, and in an instant, all the surrounding black clouds surged toward him, a terrifying wave of magical pressure sweeping across the entire canyon. Snapping back to his senses, the Crown Prince immediately shouted for everyone to retreat. Then, disregarding his own safety, charged toward Little Bo, but the enemy's attack was simply too fast. Just as Eowyn was about to reach the girl, the bridge snapped in two. Her heart belonged only to her brother, yet at the moment they plunged off the cliff. It was the Crown Prince who threw himself down alongside her without a second thought. The young man clutched the girl tightly in his arms, protecting her even though he knew full well in his heart that Little Bo despised him. He was still willing to die for her without hesitation. Eowyn wished desperately that time could simply stop right there. But the very next instant, searing pain tore through his entire body, and the two of them plunged together into the depths of a hidden lake. Amid the darkness, Little Bohi sensed a warm glow of light, as though someone were calling out to her, and the girl's eyes snapped open, only to find, to her astonishment, that she was completely unharmed. While Eowyn lay quietly beside her, the young man looked as though he were merely sleeping, yet his complexion carried the ashen pallor of someone on the brink of death. In that moment, Little Bo was terrified. She used every last bit of strength she had to press down on the Crown Prince's chest, tears mixing with the rain streaming down her cheeks. But even as she shivered uncontrollably from the cold, the girl never stopped what she was doing. She wanted so badly to tell Eowyn, in person, that she didn't truly hate him, but it seemed everything had already come too late. Just as Little Boe was sinking into despair, the young man on the ground suddenly began coughing violently, his frail state looking as though he might stop breathing at any moment. Yet even so, he still couldn't resist teasing the young noble lady. "Seeing that I'm okay, does that upset you?" The Crown Prince simply hadn't wanted to see the girl he loved cry, never realizing that his current state only made Little Bo's heart ache even more. After resting for a good while longer, the badly wounded Eowyn finally managed to sit up, every inch of his body aching, yet he couldn't afford to collapse just yet. The hooded figure who had destroyed the bridge could strike again at any moment, and at a time like this, only he could protect Little Bo. But just as he tried to rise, everything around him suddenly blurred, and amid Little Bo's startled cries, the young man slipped back into unconsciousness. The pouring rain beat down mercilessly on the two of them, and the young noble lady knew that from here on, she would have to face whatever came next entirely on her own. By the time Eowyn woke again, half a day had already passed, his once-soaked clothing now completely dry, and draped over his body was a makeshift blanket, pulled together from who knows what. But looking around, he couldn't find any trace of Little Bo anywhere, and the young man's heart instantly leapt into his throat. But just then, the girl's sweet voice rang out from the mouth of the cave. "Are you awake?" Eowyn turned toward the sound, and saw the young noble lady already kneeling obediently beside him, and it seemed she no longer resisted his presence quite as much as before. Yet the Crown Prince was determined to drive her away right then, his whole body covered in wounds and burning with fever. Yet he stubbornly wanted to send the girl he loved away, because the assassins sent by the Empress were already on their way, and in his weakened state there was no way he could protect Little Bohe. The only option left now was to trick the girl into leaving. After all, the only person the Emperor had ever truly wanted dead was him, her worthless failure of a son. With that thought, the young man lowered his head and, in a deliberately harsh tone, tried to drive Little Bo away, believing that if the girl left, he could at least die without regret. But Eowyn's provocation had no effect whatsoever. Little Bo not only had no intention of leaving, she even grew concerned about his weakened condition instead. At this point, the young man had completely lost his composure, and he asked the girl, trembling, whether she couldn't understand what he was saying, that the two of them were about to die any moment now. The Emperor had never intended to spare him, and if Little Bo didn't run now, it would soon be too late to escape at all. Eowyn hugged himself in dejection, his voice breaking with barely suppressed sobs. He told the young noble lady that his plan had already been seen through by the Empress from the very start. That woman, he said, simply wanted to toy with him like a cat with a mouse, to savor his humiliation, so if she wasn't willing to die alongside him, she should drop her pointless pity and just get out of here already. The moment the young man finished speaking, an eerie silence settled over the cave, and just as Eowyn assumed the girl had already left, a pale, delicate hand suddenly reached out, stuffing a strange fruit into his mouth, the young noble lady sternly insisting he must not spit it out. It turned out this fruit was something the girl had braved the pouring rain to gather for him, a natural remedy to bring down his fever, and in that moment, the young man felt a warmth settle deep in his chest. Yet the danger posed by the Empress still hadn't passed, and Eowyn tried once more to persuade the young noble lady to leave. But before he could even finish speaking, the girl firmly cut him off. "You got hurt saving me. I may be weak, but I have people I want to protect too. And I believe you'll be fine, Your Highness, because no matter how hopeless things seem, if you just hold on until the very end, a miracle will happen." Just as little Bo spoke these words, a beam of sunlight happened to break through into the cave, warm light enveloping the two of them. And outside, unnoticed by either of them, the rain had already cleared, giving way to a bright, sunlit sky. The clear, open sky reminded Eowyn of a dream he'd once had as a child. Back then, all he'd wanted was to one day fly free like a bird. And he really shouldn't have given up so easily. Thanks to little Bo's encouragement, the young man's eyes grew red-rimmed with emotion, and in the end, he couldn't resist teasing the girl one more time. "You really are a fool." Meanwhile, word had already reached the ducal estate that little Bohei had been killed. And the moment her brother learned his sister had fallen off the cliff, he completely lost control on the spot. With his sister's fate hanging in the balance after the fall, the news of it instantly shattered him. The only thing sustaining him now was the singular belief that he would bring his sister home safely. He didn't dare even imagine the worst possible outcome. But if anything had truly happened to little Bowie, he swore he would send every single person responsible down to accompany her in death. Julius mounted the fastest horse in the entire Knight Order, determined to bring his sister back safe and sound. While everyone back at the ducal estate was worried half to death, the two of them at the bottom of the cliff had instead settled into a rather leisurely camping life, free from all the scheming and treachery of court life. The two of them now felt more like a pair of close, easy friends. The injured crown prince taking charge of guarding their makeshift camp, while little Bo, well-versed in survival skills, went out to forage for food. After several days spent together, Eowyn's impression of the young noble lady had undergone a complete transformation. He had always assumed little Bohei was a delicate flower raised in a greenhouse, someone too fragile to survive outside the protective bubble the Grand Duke had built around her. But now the young man was seeing an entirely different side of her, her skirt covered in dust, her hair a tangled, disheveled mess. Yet this version of little Bohei radiated a vibrant, powerful energy from head to toe. Even without any makeup or adornment at all, she looked more beautiful to him than any girl he had ever seen before. Eowyn knew full well by now that his heart had been completely captured, yet he still couldn't quite understand how a young noble lady raised in such comfort and privilege had ever learned to survive out in the wild like this. Noticing the young man's inquisitive gaze, little Bo scratched her head bashfully and explained that as a child she had often wandered through forests, and out of sheer hunger had eventually learned how to forage for food on her own. But as if brushing up against some painful memory, the light in the girl's eyes dimmed instantly. Seeing this, Eowyn immediately realized he'd said the wrong thing, and quickly steered the conversation back to himself, telling little Bo that as a child he had very nearly been strangled to death by the Empress, but he supposed he was simply hardy enough to keep surviving against the odds every single time. So this time, too, he was certain nothing bad would happen to them. With that, he turned back and gave the girl a reassuring, confident look. But just then, he noticed the necklace around little Bo's neck. And if his eyes weren't deceiving him, this was a spirit stone specifically designed to shield magical power. No wonder the mage's levitation spell had failed to save her at the moment she fell off the cliff. At the thought, Eowyn suddenly grabbed hold of the pendant, anxiously asking little Bohei who had given it to her. Caught off guard, the girl's face went pale, and she stammered that it had been a gift from her brother. But the crown prince's next words sent the blood draining from her entire body. This, he told her, was a piece of dark magic specifically designed to seal away magical power. In an instant, countless unsettling thoughts flooded into her mind. She didn't know whether it was her identity as the sacrifice that had been exposed, or whether her brother truly meant to kill her. But every single possibility that occurred to her left her drenched in a cold sweat. Little Bo could no longer make out anything Eowyn was saying. Her mind consumed entirely by a single, relentless thought. Her brother was going to abandon her. He had remained unmarried his whole life for her sake. Yet now, it seemed, he was preparing to kill her instead. And at that thought, little Bo felt an icy chill spread through her entire body. Her hand still clutching the pendant, trembling uncontrollably. She could accept her brother sealing away her magical power, but she couldn't bear to face the disappointment in his eyes. Little Bo told herself, deceiving even herself, that perhaps her brother had done this to protect her, worried she might fall victim to another dark magic attack, or perhaps concerned that the Grand Priest might sense the magical power within her. Just as Little Bo's thoughts spiraled further and further out of control, Eowyn's sharp reprimand snapped her out of it. He told her to get rid of that cursed chain immediately, otherwise his own magic wouldn't be able to protect her at all. But no sooner had he finished speaking than the girl instinctively clutched the pendant to her chest, stubbornly clinging to the belief that her brother would never deceive her. Yet the fact that the mage's spell had failed was undeniable too, and in the end, the girl reluctantly gave in and removed the necklace, the lovely butterfly pendant still shimmering just as brilliantly as it had before. Yet Little Bo's heart had already gone cold. The next day, the young noble lady, who hadn't slept a wink all night, rose early, planning to go out again to forage for more edible fruit. Eowyn had originally intended to go along with her too, but the sight of his pale, haggard face alone was enough to make anyone's heart ache. And even though the young man insisted repeatedly that he was a powerful member of the Dragonkin lineage himself, Little Bo firmly insisted he stay behind and rest instead. Yet Little Bo never expected that she herself would end up running into a dangerous monster. She was carefully identifying which berries were safe to eat, her mind still preoccupied with what had happened the day before. After a long night of deep reflection, she had already convinced herself firmly that her brother would never harm her. After all, that man was willing to give up his own life for her sake. How could he possibly bear to abandon her? At this very moment, all the girl wanted was for her brother to receive word of her whereabouts as soon as possible, and she found herself missing home more than a little. But just then, a rustling sound stirred in the bushes, and Little Bo instinctively turned around, only to feel a wave of bone-deep despair wash over her the moment she saw the creature before her. The sacred grounds of the goddess Tamara. How could there possibly be a monster here? The monster's blood-red eyes stared unblinkingly at her, and just as its sharp claws were about to strike, at that critical moment, a powerful surge of survival instinct erupted from deep within the girl, and a few long-lost memories were forcibly jolted awake. Trembling, Little Bo commanded the creature before her not to come any closer, then immediately squeezed her eyes shut in fear. But to her shock, the monster actually obeyed her command, and as she watched the terrifying figure gradually vanish into the mist, the girl finally allowed herself to let out a long breath of relief, forcing her racing heart to calm down. But when she lifted her head, she found herself face to face with Eowyn's stunned expression. The young man's eyes were filled with something like suppressed terror, and he asked, trembling, "Are you really a heretic?" The monster had opened its massive jaws, yet with just a single glance from Little Bo, it had been driven back in fear, and this entire scene had unfolded right before Eowyn's eyes. He stared at the girl in complete disbelief, and after a long moment, finally managed to force out the words, trembling all over, "Are you really a heretic?" Little Bo had already been scared half out of her wits by the monster, and now, having her long-guarded secret exposed by Eowyn on top of it, blow after blow left her looking noticeably shaken. She staggered to her feet, trying to convince the Crown Prince to believe her. But the young man instinctively took half a step back, loudly demanding to know why she had lied to him. This left Little Bo completely panicked, and she stammered out incoherent excuses trying to defend herself, her eyes welling up with tears as she spoke. Watching this, Eowyn instantly felt his heart soften. But just then an eerie, unsettling presence suddenly stirred within the forest, an overwhelming pressure that sent chills through everyone nearby. And sensing the danger, the young man immediately shielded Little Bo behind him, while at the same moment, a man cloaked entirely in black emerged from the depths of the forest. And judging by his build, this had to be the very same person who had attacked them on the suspension bridge. Seeing this, the Crown Prince immediately braced himself in a defensive stance, fully prepared to sacrifice himself to protect Little Bo. But he never imagined that the person his mother had sent would turn out to be the Grand Duke's own teacher. This man's strength far surpassed anything they had imagined, and a reckless attack now would be nothing short of suicide. Just as Eowyn was trying to figure out how to buy them some time, a swift figure suddenly appeared before the two of them, and a flash of joy crossed Little Bo's eyes. It was Julian coming to save them, which meant her brother had to be somewhere nearby too. If they could just hold out a little longer, they'd be saved. But Little Bo had not yet realized just how formidable the man in black truly was. In the blink of an eye, a dense cloud of black mist had already gathered around the man's hands, and the mist condensed into a whip that lashed out viciously toward the group. At the critical moment, Julian took the deadly blow head-on. But before he could even steady his footing, a brutal fist slammed once more into his face, sending the young man flying like a discarded sack. The sheer gap in power between them made devastatingly clear in that single instant. Little Bo could do nothing but plead helplessly from the sidelines. And watching this, Eloin felt his own heart clench in sympathy. He called out to Ulrich, begging him to spare the others, saying he would willingly return to accept his mother's punishment. But before he could even finish speaking, he too was struck down mercilessly by the man. Watching everyone who tried to protect her fall, one after another, Little Bo felt an utter, crushing despair. Desperately, she prayed for her brother to appear and save her. Yet no matter how hard she prayed, no miracle came. In this life-or-death moment, the badly wounded Julian struggled once more to his feet, using his own actions to declare that anyone who wanted to hurt the girl would have to step over his dead body first. Her devoted little watchdog, who loved her so deeply, was about to die right before her eyes. Yet the cost of saving him would mean never being able to stay by her brother's side ever again. In that moment, Little Bo felt a bone-deep despair settle over her. Only two paths lay before her now. Yet no matter which one she chose, a dead end awaited her either way. Summon a monster to save Julian, and her identity as the cult's sacrifice would be exposed for good. But if she let Julian go, how could she possibly bring herself to do that? They had sworn beneath the cherry blossoms to be lifelong friends? And besides, Julian had only gotten hurt in the first place trying to protect her. There was no way she could abandon him now, whatever the cost. Just as the man in black's attack was about to land, Little Bo's gaze suddenly hardened with resolve. She felt a strange, powerful force flooding through her entire body. The memories she had so deliberately tried to forget were slowly stirring awake once more. Everything that man had once taught her. The girl let herself go completely blank, and the next instant, a colossal beast several dozen meters tall lunged ferociously toward the man in black. The sudden arrival of this massive creature on the battlefield instantly turned the tide in their favor, sending the man flying violently through the air. But at the same time, Little Bo's own body began sending out warning signs from the strain, blood gushing from her nose and mouth. Yet even trembling in agony, she refused to let up. And so, a girl and her beast continued their fierce struggle against the man in the woods. The Crown Prince, too, had regained consciousness, and he hurried to pull Little Bo along, urging her to flee for her lives immediately, because he knew all too well just how powerful the man in black truly was, and understood better than anyone that even 10 monsters like this one combined would be no match for him. But Little Bo refused no matter what to run away. She had to save Julian's life. Yet she never imagined the monster would fall so quickly. A series of deafening booms rang out one after another, and moments later, the man in black emerged from a thick haze of blood. Dragging his cursed sword behind him, even hidden behind his mask, Little Bo could sense the cruel, satisfied smile on his face. This had truly been her last card to play. And with that thought, the girl closed her eyes in despair. But just then, a warm holy light suddenly enveloped her. That familiar, comforting sensation instantly putting her at ease, and when Little Bowie opened her eyes again, she found Julius already standing firmly in front of her, shielding her. Her brother had finally come, and in an instant, all of the pent-up grievance she'd carried melted away into tears of happiness, the weight pressing on the girl's heart finally lifting. While Julius himself was already burning with unrestrained fury, the sight of his sister's blood-red mess only stoked the fire raging through every nerve in his body. And a massive fireball with no regard for cost hurtled straight toward the man in black. Even if this man had once been his own teacher, anyone who dared to harm his sister would pay for it in blood. The blood-soaked girl had finally been rescued by her brother, who arrived just in time. The man stood before Little Bo like a god descended from the heavens, fury simmering beneath his composed exterior. And the very next moment, a searing fireball detonated right beside the man in black, splitting a massive, sturdy tree clean in half in an instant. And this was still only a warning from Julius. As the man raised his hand once more, his eyes turned a blazing luminous gold, an overwhelming pressure spreading across the entire forest, the ground itself trembling violently beneath the sheer force of his spirit power. Faced with such terrifying power, the man in black knew full well his chances of victory were slim to none, and so he told the Grand Duke that he had simply been acting on the Empress's orders, tasked with bringing the two children back safely and unharmed. But the moment he said this, Julius's expression darkened sharply, and he growled through gritted teeth. "So this is what you call safe and unharmed? Facing Julius, the man in black shamelessly remarked that he wouldn't mind trading a few blows with the Grand Duke. But it seemed someone's precious little sister was already at her limit. Hearing this, Julius felt as though he'd been doused in ice water. He turned stiffly to look at his weakened sister, and the fury that had consumed him moments ago finally began to cool. He knew full well that whether it was the Empress or the Temple, all of them were simply trying to use Bohei as leverage to extort the Ectonia family's spirit stones, and as long as he refused to hand over the mining rights, his sister would remain in danger indefinitely. Even if Ulrich died here today, tomorrow there would only be another assassin sent by the Empress. With that thought, Julius reluctantly withdrew his attack. "Get out of here, you dog of the Emperor!" He didn't bother watching the man in black's retreating figure, instead turning to crouch down in front of little Bo, the girl's face pale as paper, and the man's own heart clenched painfully in response. He spoke gently to comfort his sister, telling her not to be afraid, that Roll would arrive shortly to heal her. But the very next moment, the girl threw herself violently into his arms, clinging to him with a force that seemed to vent out all the grievances of these past several days. Tears streaked little Bo's face, yet the corners of her mouth curved into a happy, contented smile, like a lost child who had finally found her way home. And safely wrapped in her brother's warm embrace, the girl drifted off into a sweet, peaceful sleep. But Julius's expression had turned grim, his hands trembling uncontrollably. He didn't even dare rest them on his sister's body, and the fear of losing her nearly overwhelming him entirely. And in that moment, the man made an agonizingly difficult decision. He would have his sister removed from the Ectonia family register. If she weren't his sister, little Bo wouldn't need to keep facing dangers like this. He loved his sister more than anything in the world, yet now he was preparing to give up custody of her. By the time little Bohei woke from her unconsciousness, her brother was quietly keeping watch by her bedside, the cool moonlight spilling over the man, making him look even more striking than any painted deity, and the girl couldn't help but steal a few extra glances. But the moment she did, her brother caught her in the act. Little Bo's fair face instantly burned scarlet, and she tried to feign sleep once more. But Julius gave her no such chance, instead asking with concern whether she felt any discomfort anywhere, his low, resonant voice as pleasing to the ear as a cello, and the girl could only sit up, blushing, and shake her head, though she noticed with a sharp, sinking feeling that her brother's expression looked unusually grim, as though he were hiding some heavy burden. Little Bo's heart sank instantly. Could her brother have discovered her secret as the sacrifice? Just as she was anxiously preparing to speak, Julius spoke first, asking little Bo if she still remembered being kidnapped by the cult of Kayla as a child. Seeing the girl nod blankly, he continued, "They had kidnapped you precisely because you are my sister, the young noble lady of the Ectonia family." With that, Julius suddenly stopped, the loose strands of hair falling over his forehead obscuring his eyes. Yet just from his posture alone, little Bohei could sense the turmoil raging within him. After a long silence, the man finally spoke again, as though he'd resolved himself to something. He told his sister he was withdrawing his sponsorship of her. "I am no longer your brother." Saying these words left Julius's heart aching more than if it had been torn apart entirely. Watching his sister's wounded, pitiful expression, he nearly couldn't stop himself from pulling the girl into a warm embrace, but he couldn't allow himself to. He had to hide behind a wall of cold indifference to mask his own reluctance. There was no better way to protect her than by drawing a clean, decisive line between them. The Empress would eventually discover little Bo's identity as the sacrifice sooner or later, and once she did, his sister's situation would only grow more dangerous. Julius wasn't afraid of going to war, but he was terrified of ever again watching her collapse, bleeding in his arms. That feeling of nearly losing the person he loved most was more agonizing than drowning. Even now, the mere thought of closing his eyes brought back the image of his sister covered in blood. And so, even knowing full well that little Bohei might come to hate him for it, he still resolved without hesitation to sever their adoption. Only Julius never expected that his usually gentle, docile sister would actually react with fury, and even end up drowning her sorrows in drink out of heartbreak. And his sister had always been so obedient and understanding, and yet here he was, casting her aside anyway. Julius slumped listlessly in his office chair, and even though he tried desperately to numb himself with paperwork, the moment he closed his eyes, all he could see was his sister's despairing gaze. Little Bo had cried so helplessly, sobbing until she couldn't breathe, looking exactly like an abandoned wild animal. Yet he couldn't allow himself to soften, because only by severing all ties with the Ectonia family Could his sister ever have a chance at a truly normal life? Of course, it wasn't as though Julius hadn't considered other options. On the very day his sister had been brought back safely, the man had gone, seething with rage, to confront the Emperor directly, fury burning in his eyes, leaving destruction in his wake wherever he passed. But faced with the Grand Duke's unrestrained anger, the Empress simply feigned complete ignorance, twisting the man in black's atrocities into nothing more than a rescue mission. And if he wanted to sulk about it, she even disgustingly offered to keep him by her side and dote on him instead, willing to pay any price for the sake of this marriage alliance. "I'd love to keep you close and spoil you. As long as Julius doesn't turn against her, she'd be more than happy to look after the young noble lady on his behalf. If the Grand Duke would just—" The young noble lady's very life had already left the man trembling with barely contained rage, and with a confrontation seeming all but inevitable, he still turned and walked away before it could come to that. In the end, he was simply too afraid. Afraid that woman might, behind the scenes, do something to hurt his sister. Afraid he might wake one day to find he had lost the family he loved most, all over again. The Empress's words had been the final straw that broke him, forcing him into the agonizing decision to give up custody of his sister. He could no longer openly care for her the way he once had, but in exchange, as long as that child could go on living a good, healthy life, he told himself, everything he'd sacrificed would be worth it. Immediately, little Bo kicked open the door. Having heard everything, drunk and swaying unsteadily on her feet, her face flushed with an intoxicating, alluring glow, why, even the ever-composed Julius was thrown off balance by his sister's state. He let out a helpless sigh, his heart aching even more than before. But not wanting his sister to notice the emotion he was suppressing, the man lowered his head evasively, deliberately adopting a cold, distant tone as he tried to draw a clean line between them. But to his shock, the very next moment, little Bo suddenly burst into tears, sobbing loudly, her tears falling like a string of broken pearls as she poured out all the grievances weighing on her heart. His sister, drunk and disheveled, stood before her brother demanding to know why he was abandoning her. Had she done something wrong to upset him? As a child, she had once witnessed the scene of a master abandoning their pet, the poor discarded puppy desperately chasing after the departing carriage. Yet no matter how hard it tried, its owner never once stopped. That pitiful sight had stayed etched in little Bo's memory ever since, and it was precisely because of it that she had always told herself to be obedient and good, believing that only a child of value would never be abandoned. Yet after all this effort, in the end, her brother still didn't want her. By this point, the girl's face was already streaked entirely with tears, and as the wronged party, she had every right to lash out and demand answers. But the words caught in her throat. She simply couldn't bring herself to resent this man who had pulled her out of darkness. It was her brother who had given her so much love, and that was exactly why she couldn't bear to let it go. The girl cried until she could barely catch her breath, and Julius felt his own heart breaking right alongside her. He knew little Bo must be in tremendous pain right now, so he gently took his sister's small hand in his low voice both tender and full of quiet strength. "Whatever you want to say, don't hold it back. Just think of it as the alcohol talking. When you're upset, you need to let it out." With her brother's comfort, the girl, who had been trying so hard to appear strong, could no longer hold herself together, and she poured out every grievance weighing on her heart. She knew her brother wanted to send her away, and that he surely had his own reasons for it. But she didn't care whether this plan was good for her or beneficial in any way. All she knew was that the person she loved most was abandoning her, and if the rest of her life had to unfold without her brother in it, she would rather just die instead. The girl's words cut through him like blade after blade, and it was only then that Julius realized just how badly he had misjudged things. He had believed he was doing this for little Bo's sake, yet he had never once stopped to ask how his sister actually felt about it. With that realization, he pulled the girl fiercely into his arms, holding her so tightly it felt as though he meant to fuse her into his very bones. "I'm sorry." The man offered this long-overdue apology, then let out a heavy sigh. "Do you understand how dangerous it is to stay by my side? If your luck runs out, you could lose your life." But the very next moment, little Bo wrapped her arms tightly around her brother in return, sobbing as she admitted that she was afraid of pain and afraid of dying, but she was even more afraid of a future where Julius wasn't in her life at all. Hearing this, the man no longer insisted on sending her away. That very night, he went to seek out Roll for help. He had always been against little Bohi learning magic before, but now he had changed his mind. Though he never imagined that this immature decision would end up pushing his sister straight into a whole new kind of danger. His sister had gotten drunk and clung to her brother, refusing to let him leave, even sobbing and whimpering as she nuzzled into his arms. But the next morning brought nothing but sheer embarrassment. Once she'd sobered up, little Bo wished she could dig a hole and crawl straight into it. What on earth had she done last night? She'd smeared snot and tears all over her brother's clothes, and even played dead under the covers, refusing to get up even after the sun had long since risen. Roel, as the household's butler, had had quite enough of this behavior, and with one firm tug, he yanked the young lady straight out from under her blankets and stripped of the warmth of her bed. Little Bo had no choice but to confront her own mistakes head-on, and she asked Roel timidly, "Are you angry? Are you angry, Roel?" The man simply broke into an unsettling grin. "Not at all. Why would I be angry with a completely wasted drunk?" Little Bo was thoroughly terrified by his menacing demeanor, and she hurriedly apologized, insisting she hadn't meant to. She'd simply felt so abandoned that she'd ended up drinking too much. But just then, she suddenly remembered the Crown Prince, the young man who had been badly wounded protecting her, and she had no idea how he was faring now. Worriedly, she asked Roel for news, only to learn, to her shock, that the young prince had gone off again to attend that potentially fatal sacred ceremony, and this time he hadn't even bothered to inform her. Thinking back on how she'd nearly lost her life because of that whole ordeal, she'd assumed that after surviving such a brush with death together, the Crown Prince would at least come to see her as someone who'd shared a life-or-death bond with him. Yet instead, he had simply disappeared without so much as a word. Just then, Roel handed little Bo the letter the young man had left behind, and curiously, the girl tore it open, only to find a single, simple line written inside. "Until we meet again." Little Bo had no idea just how much emotion Eowyn had poured into those few short words. At that very moment, he was setting out entirely alone on a perilous journey, and this letter was the promise he had left behind for little Bo. He was determined to make it back alive, and he would take the young noble lady back from that old man of a Grand Duke's clutches. With that thought, the young man lifted his head, staring straight into the sun, resolved to be brave, if only this once for little Bowie's sake. Of course, this particular slow-witted young lady remained completely oblivious to the Crown Prince's feelings for her. Her concern for him was purely the kind one friend feels for another, and by now, she herself had more than enough troubles of her own to worry about. Her brother was about to send her away, and no matter how much she cried or threw a fit, nothing was going to change that outcome. Thinking of having to part ways with the family who cared so deeply for her, little Bohé felt tears welling up in her eyes once more, and she asked Roel dejectedly if she were no longer the young noble lady. Would everyone stop treating her the way they had before? But to the girl's surprise, Roel's answer turned out to be a firm yes, and she looked up in disbelief, only to see the man tell her with a perfectly serious expression that if it weren't for the constraints of her position as his young mistress, he would absolutely have scolded her thoroughly, like a strict parent, the last time she'd gotten drunk. With that, Roel's expression softened. To him, little Bo felt just like a younger sister. If it weren't for their master-servant relationship, they could have been far more relaxed with each other, chatting freely and sharing amusing stories about their own pasts. Hearing this, little Bohé suddenly went pale. What she feared most was being asked about her past. All those things she was too afraid, too unwilling to face. Only now, faced with the reality that she would soon be parting ways with all of them, no matter how much reluctance and sorrow weighed on her heart, there was nothing more she could do about it. In that moment, little Bo suddenly felt an overwhelming urge to reveal her secret to everyone. She wanted to open her heart completely to this family who loved her so much.